What if medieval history isn't what happened, but what survived approval? A world without a free press. A world where literacy equals power, where truth passes through priests, scribes, and royal seals before it's allowed to exist at all. Behind cathedral walls, beneath monastery floors, linger stories never meant to survive. Annulments that erase heirs, excommunications that unking a man in a single sentence, charters misplaced at the exact moment they become inconvenient. The official record is always clean, God's judgment, a sinner struck down, a realm rescued by providence. But the real medieval archive is jagged. Hostile chroniclers, court-friendly annals, coerced confessions, and the loudest evidence of all, silence. A missing name, a vanished child, a succession that becomes obvious only after the knives are put away and the ink has dried. These endings are documented, and they repeat, not a scandal, a system. Tonight, we dig beneath the velvet of coronations to unearth 30 cursed medieval kings, after whom their dynasties fell. Welcome to 30 cursed medieval kings after whom their dynasties fell. If you're into unsettling truths, bloodlines turned into legal traps, sanctified language used as a weapon, and whole lives scrubbed clean by the people holding the parchment, subscribe. Because this isn't just about death, it's about control. Who gets anointed, who gets condemned, and who gets erased. Drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Midnight in Manchester, 2 a.m. in Kyiv, sunrise in Sydney. Perfect content for late-night candlelight hours, wherever you are. Now, listen closely. When heirs fail, institutions don't mourn. They move in. 711, Iberia. The air tastes like wax and torch smoke, not nationhood. Time is measured by bells, not clocks. Truth is filtered through scripture, oath, and seal, then copied by men who know exactly who pays for parchment. And into that world steps Roderic, a king whose crown doesn't rest on gold so much as on one fragile agreement, that other powerful men will keep calling him legitimate. The official story is always neat. Later, Christian memory loves a clean moral. A sinful ruler, divine punishment, a kingdom struck down because it deserved it. In those retellings, Roderic becomes a warning label. The fall of Visigothic Spain turns into a sermon. Convenient, isn't it? History with a built-in excuse. But when you peel back the later moralizing and stare at what the early record actually offers, fragmentary, biased, surviving by accident, the curse looks less like heaven and more like fracture. A contested succession, rival factions, a realm already split into camps before any outside force finishes the job. In other words, the dynasty doesn't fall in one dramatic moment. It is softened up first by internal legitimacy rot. The chronicle of 754 mentions contentions among the nobles. The Leon chroniclers hint at rival claimants. But these sources are like looking through fog. Every detail serves someone's political purpose decades after the fact. What emerges isn't a clear picture, but a pattern. The kingdom that Muslim forces encounter in 754 is not united. It's a collection of competing interests held together by tradition rather than loyalty. Here's what we can reconstruct from the archaeological evidence and administrative remnants. Visigothic Spain had become a confederacy, where regional dukes wielded more practical power than the king in Toledo. Coin distributions show how royal authority had become symbolic in many provinces. Charter witness lists reveal how the great nobles stopped attending royal assemblies, or attended selectively depending on which political wind seemed strongest. Here's the pattern. In a medieval kingdom, a disputed accession is not a private scandal. It's a structural crack. Because once the throne is questioned, every oath becomes conditional. Every noble asks the same silent question: who will win and who will right? The official narrative you'll hear in sanctified language is that the catastrophe arrives as a punishment. But the darker truth is hidden in what's missing and what's contradictory, whose names drop out of lists, which loyalties look hesitant, which accounts sound like they're protecting someone. We don't get a modern press conference. We get a battlefield rumor turned into a paragraph by a chronicler with a patron. Count Julian's betrayal, if it happened, reads like the inevitable outcome of a system where local lords had learned to think strategically rather than loyally. The Muslim sources describe negotiations. Not dramatic, military confrontation, but diplomatic calculation. Someone had been talking to someone. Arrangements had been made. So the reconstruction has to be honest about uncertainty. We say documents suggest, chronicles hint, later sources reinterpret. We don't claim certainty where the parchment doesn't give it. But even with that caution, one thing is hard to ignore. The kingdom was not a single body. It was a coalition, and coalitions collapse when legitimacy is disputed, because everyone starts saving themselves first. Now add invasion into that equation. In a united realm, an invader faces a wall of coordinated response. In a fractured one, an invader meets something far more useful. Options. A rival who thinks he can bargain. A faction that thinks it can survive by switching sides. A local power that thinks the crown is temporary anyway. The Battle of Guadalete, where Roderic dies, reads like a military collapse that had been building for years. Contemporary sources describe desertion rather than defeat. Troops who simply walked away. Nobles who vanished before the fighting ended. This wasn't tactical failure. It was institutional breakdown expressing itself through military disintegration. And this is where the sensory medieval world matters. Imagine the court at Toledo. Damp stone corridors, the scratch of quills, sealed letters passed hand to hand. The language of holiness draped over raw politics. Bells calling men to prayer, while messengers ride with news that can collapse a region's loyalty in a single night. The curse isn't thunder. It's paperwork. It's whispered counsel. It's a decision made in a chapel that sounds like piety and behaves like strategy. They said the kingdom fell because a king was wicked. The record suggests it fell because the kingdom could no longer agree on what a king even was. And once that agreement breaks, the dynasty is already dying. The invasion doesn't create the collapse. It completes it. And Roderic wouldn't be the last. Because the next cursed king shows us something even colder. You don't always need a battlefield to end a dynasty. Sometimes you just need a monastery and the right kind of silence. 751. Francia. A world where the crown is holy, but only as long as the right men keep saying it is. The smell here isn't sea salt or battlefield mud. It's parchment dust, beeswax, and the stale air of rooms where decisions are made quietly, then announced as if God himself signed the document. The official story presents Childeric III as the last of a fading line. A weak, ceremonial figure. The sort of king whose name appears in the record like a formality, useful for legitimacy, useless for rule. Then comes the necessary correction. A stronger leader rises, order is restored, and the realm is saved. But the surviving pattern beneath that tidy explanation is brutal in its calmness. Because Childeric III is not simply defeated, he is reclassified. The Annals of Saint Bertin describe the deposition with bureaucratic precision. Childeric, who bore the name of king falsely, was shorn and sent to a monastery. Notice the language. Not the king was deposed, but he who bore the name of king falsely. The violence is grammatical. The king is edited out of existence through careful word choice. This is how medieval systems end dynasties without turning the streets red. They take a king and turn him into a monk. They remove him from the political world and place him inside a sanctified one, where resistance becomes sin and silence becomes piety. It looks merciful. It sounds holy. It is functionally life imprisonment wrapped in prayer. The process reveals a sophisticated understanding of how power actually works. The Carolingian takeover isn't a sudden coup. It's an administrative transition that had been building for decades. The mayors of the palace had been governing while the Merovingian kings provided symbolic legitimacy. Charles Martel commanded armies. Pepin III controlled resources. The king signed documents and appeared at ceremonies. Here's where the church becomes essential. Pope Zachary doesn't just approve Pepin's coronation, he provides theological justification that converts political opportunism into divine mandate. The papal letter states, "It is better that he be called king who has the power than he who remains without royal power." Translation: effective rule trumps inherited right when effective rule serves church interests. The official narrative says the realm needed a real ruler. The darker truth is that power had already moved. Administrators, war leaders, and court managers were doing the work while the king served as a symbolic seal. And once symbolism is all you are, you become disposable, because symbolism can be transferred. Here, the church is not a background character. It's the legitimacy engine. Deposition isn't just political, it is moralized. The language matters: stability, order, necessity, divine favor. These words are not decoration, they're tools. They turn an unconstitutional takeover, by modern standards, into a sacred repair. And look at the method. You don't merely remove the man, you remove his future. A dynasty is not a single person. It's the promise of heirs. When Childeric III is enclosed within monastic walls, the bloodline is functionally sealed in a stone box. No public trial needed. No messy martyrdom. Just quiet disappearance from the political stage, and then, later, quiet disappearance from the record itself. The monastery of Saint-Omer receives its most famous involuntary resident. The chronicles describe his entry into religious life with studied politeness. He embraced the contemplative life. But contemporary documents reveal the reality. Armed guards, restricted movement, complete isolation from former political connections. The monastery becomes a prison that calls itself salvation. This is where medieval truth control shows its teeth. A chronicler can write with a straight face that the deposition was a righteous correction. A court can circulate the story that the realm is healthier now, and because literacy equals power, the people who can write are often the people who benefit. So we reconstruct carefully. We note how annals frame the shift as stability. We track how official documents start centering the new power. We watch how the old king's presence fades into a footnote, and we treat the silence as evidence, not proof of innocence or guilt, but proof of control. Now, picture the scene you open on. A king whose hair, symbolic, charged with meaning, is cut. A monastery door closes. The chants begin. Outside, the machinery of state keeps moving, almost relieved. Inside, the former king becomes a religious captive. The bells keep ringing, as if nothing happened. That's the horror of it. Not the violence, but the ease. They didn't kill him. They archived him. And that brings us, awkwardly, to the next step in the pattern, when the church doesn't just allow a dynasty to end, but helps sanctify the takeover. Because once a crown can be moved, it can be sold, traded, or conquered for the good of the faithful. The chapel air is thick with incense and political calculation. Candlelight flickers across marriage contracts that read like military treaties. This is diplomacy that smells like steel wrapped in holy water. Desiderius, king of the Lombards, finds himself trapped in a web that looks like alliance but functions like a snare. The marriage of his daughter Desiderata to Charlemagne was supposed to secure his kingdom's future. Instead, it becomes the rope that hangs his dynasty. The year is 770. The marriage negotiations seem like standard royal diplomacy. A Lombard princess, a Frankish prince, a papal blessing that makes the alliance look divinely sanctioned. Pope Stephen III even supports the match initially, anything to balance the complex power dynamics of 8th century Italy. But medieval marriage contracts are written in disappearing ink, and political convenience can evaporate faster than morning dew. The official narrative is elegant in its simplicity. Aeneas' righteous campaign restores order to Italy. The papal letters speak of divine mandate. The Frankish chronicles frame it as liberation, clean, holy, necessary. But underneath that sanctified language lies a different machine entirely. Papal alignment plus dynastic marriages plus conquest equals a legal theological trap that ends a bloodline. The marriage contract becomes evidence. The papal blessing becomes justification. The military campaign becomes inevitable conclusion. Here's how medieval politics really worked. Treaties were not peace agreements. They were future war plans written in legal language. When Desiderius arranged that marriage alliance, he wasn't securing friendship. He was giving his enemies a legal claim to interference. Every wedding feast becomes a potential funeral procession, because marriage ties create inheritance arguments. The sequence unfolds with mechanical precision. Charlemagne repudiates Desiderata in 771, sending her back to her father's court. The official reason: sterility. She had failed to produce heirs quickly enough, but the timing suggests calculation rather than disappointment. The Frankish court had been observing papal politics, waiting for the moment when Lombard alliance became Lombard liability. Pope Hadrian I's succession in 772 changes everything. Where Stephen III had sought balance, Hadrian seeks Lombard elimination. The papal correspondence reveals the true architecture of the plot. Hadrian doesn't just ask for Frankish intervention, he provides theological justification for it. The letters speak of protection and restoration of stolen lands. But protection from whom? Restoration to whom? The language is careful. The meaning is clear. We need a new king here. The Codex Carolinus preserves Hadrian's diplomatic strategy. Each letter carefully builds the case: Lombard aggression against papal territories, violations of previous agreements, threats to Christian pilgrims. Whether these charges were accurate becomes irrelevant when papal authority legitimizes Frankish intervention. The accusation becomes the justification. And this is where medieval warfare gets genuinely terrifying. It's not just about conquest, it's about legitimacy laundering. Charlemagne doesn't just invade Lombardy, he liberates it. He doesn't steal the crown. He accepts it from proper authority, the Pope, speaking for God, ratifying what heaven has already decided. The evidence anchors this pattern in cold administrative reality. Treaty documents show how marriage clauses can be reinterpreted as casus belli. Papal correspondence demonstrates how spiritual authority converts a naked ambition into holy obligation. Court-sponsored chronicles reveal how conquest becomes correction in the official record. The siege of Pavia in 773 and 774 reads like a business liquidation rather than military conquest. Desiderius doesn't die heroically in battle. He surrenders when starvation makes resistance pointless. The Lombard nobles don't fight to the death for their king. They negotiate individual terms that preserve their lands under new management. This is institutional change disguised as military victory. Desiderius ends his life in a monastery, not dead, but erased. His sons vanish from the record entirely. The Lombard kingdom becomes a Frankish possession. But here's the crucial detail. This isn't presented as conquest. It's presented as divine restoration of proper order. The documentation is meticulous. The justification is bulletproof. Picture the final scene. A king kneeling before the altar not in prayer, but in surrender. The marriage contract that was supposed to secure his bloodline becomes the legal foundation for its extinction. The papal blessing he sought for legitimacy becomes the warrant for his deposition. The alliance he built for protection becomes the mechanism of his destruction. The curse is paperwork with an army behind it. And sometimes the curse returns through exile, restoration, and a final purge that makes the first fall look like mercy. Constantinople, 711. The palace corridors echo with whispered factions and the metallic calm that settles before a coup. The emperor has returned from exile, nose reconstructed, throne reclaimed, enemies' lists updated. But restoration and legitimacy are not the same thing. And Justinian II is about to learn that some falls are fatal, even when you survive them. 10 years earlier, in 695, the same palace had witnessed Justinian's first deposition. The chroniclers of that event described popular uprising against imperial tyranny, but the mechanics reveal something more calculated. A surgical removal orchestrated by military commanders and court officials who had concluded that Justinian's governance style threatened their survival. The mutilation had been precise. The nose severed, ensuring that imperial dignity was literally disfigured. In Byzantine political theory, a maimed emperor couldn't rule, making the disfigurement both punishment and constitutional barrier. But Justinian proved more resilient than his enemies anticipated. The exile years in Cherson and among the Bulgars gave him time to plan, recruit allies, and perfect his understanding of how power actually works. When he returned in 705, it wasn't through popular acclamation or divine intervention, it was through careful military preparation and diplomatic negotiation that created temporary coalition strong enough to overthrow his successors. The official narrative presents this as divine justice. A tyrant punished, briefly, then punished permanently when he fails to learn his lesson. Order restored, stability preserved, the empire saved from a madman's return. But what actually happened reveals the mechanical reality beneath imperial theater. Cycles of deposition and return exhaust the legitimacy engine. Every restoration requires new allies. Every new alliance creates fresh enemies. Every compromise weakens the center until the dynasty breaks under the weight of its own survival tactics. The Chronographia of Theophanes provides crucial details about Justinian's second reign. The emperor's behavior suggests someone who understood that his restoration was temporary, unless he could eliminate the structural problems that had caused his first fall. The purges began immediately. Not random violence, but systematic elimination of anyone who had participated in or benefited from the previous regime. But here's the trap. The purges that were supposed to secure his throne actually accelerated its collapse. Each execution created new enemies among the families of the condemned. Each confiscation redistributed wealth in ways that created resentment rather than loyalty. The emperor's attempts to strengthen his position weakened it by multiplying the number of people who needed him dead. The chronicle contradictions tell the real story. Some sources describe Justinian's return as triumphant. Others hint at the quiet terror that followed. The court rhetoric of tyranny appears in documents written after his final fall, suggesting that his crimes were more political than moral, more threatening to specific interests than universally abhorrent. Contemporary sources are more circumspect. The administrative acts from 705 and 711 show an emperor trying to govern normally. Legal decisions, military appointments, religious policies. But underneath the routine imperial business, the personnel changes reveal the paranoid logic of a restored ruler. Constant rotation of officials, geographic shuffling of military commands, systematic replacement of anyone whose loyalty seemed questionable. Here's the pattern. A medieval ruler can survive one deposition by proving he's still necessary, but the second time, he's proving he's unkillable. And that's exactly what makes him too dangerous to leave alive. The 711 revolt follows a different script from the 695, deposition. The first had required elaborate justification and careful management of imperial dignity. The second is blunt instrument, military mutiny that ends with Justinian's execution and the elimination of his immediate family. No exile this time, no possibility of return. Complete dynastic extinction through administrative efficiency. The documented sequence of regime shifts reads like an administrative manual for dynasty extinction. Deposition, exile, restoration, purges, counter-purges, final deposition, execution. Each step follows logically from the last. The curse isn't supernatural intervention, it's institutional memory learning how to prevent returns. Philippikos, who replaces Justinian, doesn't present himself as liberator or reformer, just as practical alternative to imperial instability. The succession documents are matter of fact. Previous emperor eliminated due to administrative necessity. New emperor selected for administrative competence. No moral rhetoric, needed when the solution is obviously superior to the problem. The curse isn't the fall, it's the repetition. Which brings us to a mother, a son, and a throne rewritten by necessity. A consecrated palace chapel where prayers sound like legal arguments. The Empress Irene kneels beside her son, but the posture is deceptive. This isn't maternal protection. It's political calculation wrapped in piety. The year is 797, but the roots of this tragedy reach back to 780, when Constantine VI became emperor at age 10 under his mother's regency. 17 years of shared power have created a constitutional nightmare. Two imperial wills, competing court factions, and a succession law that had never contemplated this level of sustained co-rule between mother and son. The official narrative speaks of stability through regency and proper order, a wise mother guiding an unstable son, temporary rule becoming permanent correction when the heir proves unworthy of power originally meant for him. But what happened beneath the ceremonial language reveals how contested authority turns into legitimacy crisis, and how dynasties end where the record grows careful. Constantine VI doesn't die in battle or plague. He disappears from the imperial record after a blinding that chronicles describe with suspicious vagueness. The contemporary sources reveal the political mechanics driving toward this conclusion. The Chronographia provides crucial details. Constantine had been attempting to assert independent authority since 790, creating what amounted to two rival imperial courts within the same palace. Military commanders, court officials, and religious leaders found themselves forced to choose between mother and son, not just personally, but institutionally. The succession phrasing in court documents tells the real story. Early records speak of co-emperors, mother and son ruling together. The legal formulations carefully balance their authorities, with Irene handling domestic administration while Constantine manages military affairs. But the language starts shifting in the 790. Later, documents drop the co-emperor formulation. They describe Constantine's authority as derived from or confirmed by Irene rather than independent. Final records present Irene as sole legitimate ruler, with Constantine's previous authority described as temporary arrangement that ended when he proved unsuitable for rule. The military revolts of 790 and 797 provide the mechanics of dynasty extinction disguised as constitutional crisis. Both rebellions nominally support Constantine against his mother, but the timing suggests orchestration rather than spontaneous uprising. Each revolt creates justification for Irene to further limit her son's independent authority. For imperial security, naturally. Court ideology provides the theological framework for what modern law would call usurpation. A mother's duty to preserve imperial stability supersedes a son's inheritance rights when the son threatens the state. The language is careful. The logic is bulletproof. The outcome is dynasty extinction disguised as institutional preservation. The Seventh Ecumenical Council of 787 provides crucial context. Irene's theological victory over iconoclasm had established her as defender of Orthodox Christianity, giving her religious authority that transcended normal gender restrictions on imperial power. When political necessity required eliminating Constantine, she possessed sufficient spiritual legitimacy to justify unprecedented action. The blinding itself occurs in the Purple Chamber, the same room where Constantine had been born. The symbolic weight is crushing. The heir, who was supposed to continue the imperial line, eliminated in the space that represents dynastic continuity. But the contemporary accounts are circumspect about details, suggesting that the event was managed for maximum political utility with minimum documentary risk. Later, hostile accounts describe the blinding as particularly brutal. But these sources come from chroniclers writing after Irene's own fall in 802, when political necessity required her demonization. The iconoclast sources, especially, had reasons to present her as monstrous. The contemporary sources are more circumspect. They speak of Constantine's withdrawal from active rule and Irene's assumption of full imperial responsibilities. Here, the medieval machinery of legitimacy shows its most sophisticated operation. You don't just remove a ruler, You make their removal look like inevitable correction of an obvious error. Constantine wasn't murdered. He was corrected. The dynasty didn't end. It was purified through maternal wisdom. The administrative aftermath reveals the thoroughness of the erasure. Constantine's name disappears from imperial documents. His appointees are quietly replaced. His military supporters are transferred to distant postings. The palace routines adjust to single imperial authority as if the co-emperor had never existed. Picture the final scene. A young emperor kneeling before his mother in a chapel that doubles as courtroom. The blessing that should have confirmed his authority becomes the ceremony of its revocation. The prayers that should have strengthened his reign become the liturgy of his political funeral. Here, order means whoever controls the narrative controls the bloodline. This wasn't corruption at the edges. It was baked into the system, and it was just beginning. October 14th, 1066. Hastings Field, where morning mist carries the scent of trampled earth and approaching cavalry. The last Anglo-Saxon king stands behind his shield wall, knowing that this battle will determine not just who rules England, but who gets to write what England even means. The day begins at dawn with Harold's exhausted army, fresh from victory at Stamford Bridge, having marched 250 miles in 4 days. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle notes the king's haste. Harold came upon the Norman host unawares. But William's chroniclers will later describe this speed as recklessness, evidence of a usurper's desperation rather than a legitimate king's duty to defend his realm. The official story becomes history's most successful rebranding campaign. Perjury punished, rightful rule triumphant, divine judgment delivered through Norman lance and arrow. Harold becomes the oath-breaker. William becomes the rightful heir. The conquest becomes a legal correction. But the reality underneath that triumphalist narrative reveals how victory rewrites legitimacy with retroactive legal authority. The Norman chroniclers don't just record conquest, they create a courtroom where Harold is tried in absentia and convicted by military verdict. The chronicles become legal briefs written in blood. William of Poitiers constructs the most sophisticated version of this legal fiction. According to his account, Harold had sworn a sacred oath on holy relics at Bayeux, promising to support William's claim to the English throne. The oath becomes evidence. The battle becomes enforcement. Harold's death becomes divine judgment on perjury. But examine the mechanics of that oath more closely. Harold was allegedly shipwrecked on Norman shores while traveling on unspecified business. Medieval hospitality required protection of guests, but it also created opportunities for coercion. A guest who depends on his host's goodwill for safe departure isn't negotiating from strength. The evidence lies in oath language preserved in narrative sources and administrative changes documented in post-conquest records. William doesn't just claim the throne. He reorganizes the entire legal foundation of royal authority. Land grants, law codes, ecclesiastical appointments. Everything gets rewritten to reflect Norman legal theory. The Domesday Book, completed 20 years after Hastings, demonstrates this legal revolution's sophistication. It doesn't just record Norman England, it creates Norman England by documenting a world where Anglo-Saxon land tenure had always been provisional, held of the king rather than owned outright. Every manor, every field, every mill becomes evidence that Norman lordship was restoring proper order rather than imposing foreign rule. Here's where medieval conquest becomes genuinely terrifying. It's not just military occupation, its legal erasure. The Domesday Book doesn't just catalog Norman England. It creates Norman England by documenting a world where Anglo-Saxon ownership never had legal validity. 20 years after Hastings, Harold's dynasty doesn't just look defeated, it looks like it was never legitimate to begin with. The Bayeux Tapestry provides visual propaganda for this narrative. Harold appears as oath-breaker and usurper, whose death restores rightful order. But notice what the tapestry doesn't show. The circumstances of that oath, the coercion that may have extracted it, or the canonical questions about whether promises made under duress have moral validity. Contemporary Anglo-Saxon sources tell a different story, where they survive. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles entry for 1066 is notably terse. Harold King was slain, and Earl Leofwine his brother, and Earl Gurth his brother, and many good men. No mention of oaths or legitimacy disputes, just death and dynastic extinction. The pattern is surgical in its precision. Defeat the army, control the chronicles, rewrite the law, and then present the conquest as inevitable correction of an obvious error. Harold didn't lose a battle. He was exposed as a usurper who temporarily deceived the realm. Within a generation, Norman legal theory becomes English constitutional tradition. Harold's reign is remembered as interregnum between Edward the Confessor's death and William's accession. The conquest disappears, replaced by rightful inheritance delayed by unfortunate usurpation. Picture the final moments: an arrow through the eye, a king dying among his hearth companions, the last Anglo-Saxon dynasty ending in the mud of a Sussex battlefield. But the real death is quieter. The slow strangulation of alternative memory through administrative efficiency. After this, law starts walking in armor. The smell of parchment and sealing wax mingles with the metallic taste of a realm that has forgotten how to choose kings. England, 1154. 19 years of civil war ending not with victory, but with negotiation that transforms monarchy into contractual property. The crisis began in 1135 with Henry I's death and the familiar medieval problem: a crown that needed inheriting and too many people with plausible claims. Matilda had the strongest genealogical argument: Henry's designated heir, Holy Roman Empress, daughter of a king. But Stephen had the crucial advantages. He was male, he was present, and he moved fast. Stephen's reign demonstrates how succession disputes become administrative puzzles. The official story presents the Treaty of Wallingford as wise compromise. Aging king accepts inevitable succession. Realm chooses stability over continued bloodshed. Divine providence guides reasonable settlement. But the reality beneath diplomatic language reveals how oaths fracture, barons become judges, and succession becomes negotiated property rather than inherited birthright. Charter witness lists from the period read like political ledgers, tracking which nobles switch sides when, which oaths get abandoned, which loyalties become conditional. The Gesta Stephani chronicles the mechanical breakdown of feudal loyalty. Barons who had sworn homage to Stephen in 1135 discover reasons to support Matilda when her cause looks ascendant. The same nobles later rediscover their loyalty to Stephen when military fortune shifts. Oaths become renewable contracts rather than sacred bonds. Robert of Gloucester, Matilda's half-brother, appears in royal charters as both rebel and loyal subject, sometimes within the same year. His allegiances shift with strategic calculation that treats civil war like a business opportunity, requiring portfolio diversification. Support both sides, hedge your bets, survive regardless of outcome. The evidence survives in the administrative acts themselves. Grants confirmed, then revoked, then confirmed again depending on military fortune. Judicial decisions that contradict each other within months. Episcopal appointments that reflect political necessity rather than canonical procedure. The machinery of state continues functioning, but legitimacy becomes a renewable contract rather than permanent status. William of Malmesbury provides the most sophisticated analysis of this constitutional breakdown. His Historia Novella describes how civil war transforms monarchy from divine appointment into temporary employment. The crown became a prize to be won by military virtue rather than inherited by royal birth. The economic evidence reveals the deeper transformation. Coin production fragments as regional mints operate independently. Tax collection becomes negotiated arrangement rather than royal prerogative. Military service turns from feudal obligation into commercial transaction. Knights serve whoever pays most, consistently. This is where medieval political theory meets brutal practicality. When nobody can agree who should be king, kingship becomes temporary employment. The crown doesn't rest on divine appointment. It rests on contemporary military political utility. Stephen doesn't lose his dynasty to conquest or assassination. He loses it to collective exhaustion with disputed succession. The Treaty of Wallingford in 1153 codifies this exhaustion into constitutional solution. The document reads like a business arrangement. Stephen retains the title for his natural life, then succession passes to Henry Plantagenet. Stephen's biological heirs are compensated with lands and titles, but excluded from royal inheritance. But examine the treaty's language more closely. Henry isn't described as rightful heir correcting usurpation. He's presented as agreed-upon successor chosen for practical reasons. The document treats monarchy like elective office rather than inherited property. The dynasty ends through negotiation rather than violence. The administrative transition demonstrates how thoroughly the Civil War had transformed English governance. Henry II doesn't restore Henrician monarchy. He creates Angevin monarchy using lessons learned from 19 years of constitutional experimentation. Royal authority becomes more bureaucratic, less personal, more systematic. Contemporary sources describe nobles' relief at the settlement. The Chronicon of John of Worcester notes, "Peace was restored to the realm through wise counsel rather than force of arms." The exhaustion is audible. After nearly 2 decades of switching sides, everyone was ready for political certainty regardless of genealogical niceties. Picture the final scene. An aging king signing away his bloodline's future in exchange for temporary peace. The document that preserves his remaining life eliminates his family's dynastic claims. The treaty that ends civil war ends his lineage as a political force. Here, exhaustion becomes the mechanism of dynasty extinction. Not battle, not plague, not assassination. Just collective agreement that this particular family tree has caused enough trouble. Now imagine that chaos, but sanctified by papal policy. Palermo, where Mediterranean light filters through Norman stone and Islamic geometric patterns. The palace whispers with multiple languages, Latin, Greek, Arabic, and multiple loyalties. Tancred sits on a throne that belongs to whoever can hold it longest. The year is 1189, and Tancred's accession exposes the structural weakness of Norman Sicily, a conquest state that had never resolved the tension between military efficiency and constitutional legitimacy. William II's death without direct heirs creates what amounts to a succession lottery where anyone with legal creativity and military resources can purchase tickets. The official narrative presents lawful rule challenged by outsiders. A legitimate heir defending his patrimony against foreign invasion disguised as legal claim. Tancred as defender of Sicilian independence, his enemies as opportunistic predators exploiting a succession crisis. But the reality reveals how inheritance disputes become international leverage points, and how legitimacy gets litigated by force when multiple claimants can construct plausible legal arguments. Treaties with papal recognition, marriage ties to various European royal houses, and competing interpretations of Norman succession law create a legal maze where anyone with an army can find a path to the throne. The documentary evidence survives in stunning complexity. Papal letters that contradict each other within months. Marriage contracts that create overlapping inheritance claims. Feudal homage ceremonies where the same vassals swear allegiance to multiple lords simultaneously. The medieval legal system wasn't designed for this level of jurisdictional overlap. The evidence survives in treaty clauses that contradict each other, papal positions that shift based on political calculation, and succession justifications that sound like legal briefs. Multiple parties claim divine sanction. Multiple chroniclers present incompatible versions of legitimate inheritance. The rightful heir depends entirely on which legal tradition you accept as authoritative. Constance of Hauteville, Henry VI's wife, claims Sicily through direct inheritance from William II. Her genealogical argument is bulletproof. Legitimate daughter of Roger II, aunt of the dead king, closest blood relative with undisputed royal descent. But she's married to the Holy Roman Emperor, making her claim a Trojan horse for German imperial expansion into Italy. Tancred counters with bastardy that had been legitimized through royal recognition, a weaker genealogical claim but stronger political argument. His supporters argue that illegitimate birth legitimized by royal decree trumps foreign marriage that threatens Sicilian autonomy. Constitutional law versus political necessity. Tancred's problem is structural. Norman Sicily was designed as a conquest state with flexible succession traditions adapted to Mediterranean political realities. That flexibility works when there's clear military dominance. It becomes fatal weakness when multiple claimants can field comparable armies and construct competing legitimacy narratives. The Holy Roman Empire claims sovereignty over Sicily through feudal theory. Sicily exists as imperial fief, making the emperor ultimate arbiter of Sicilian succession. The papacy claims authority through overlordship agreements negotiated during previous crises. Local Norman barons claim consultation rights through constitutional precedents. Everyone has legal standing to interfere. Various Norman nobles claim inheritance rights through biological or adoptive relationships that had seemed politically irrelevant when established, but become crucial when succession disputes create opportunities for advancement. Distant cousins discover previously overlooked genealogical connections. Adopted heirs demand recognition of succession rights that had been ceremonial until they became practical. Local Muslim and Greek populations have their own ideas about legitimacy that don't necessarily align with any Norman legal tradition. The administrative systems that had made Norman Sicily function smoothly under strong kings become sources of institutional conflict when central authority becomes contested. The military campaigns of 1191 to 1194 demonstrate how medieval succession disputes function when legal arguments require armed enforcement. Henry VI doesn't just invade Sicily, he inherits it through his wife's claims, backed by papal recognition, supported by imperial authority, justified through Norman constitutional precedents that nobody can definitively refute. Tancred doesn't lose because he's weak or illegitimate. He loses because his opponents have better international connections and more sophisticated legal diplomatic machinery. Henry VI doesn't just conquer Sicily. He inherits it through his wife's claims with papal blessing, supported by imperial authority, justified through Norman succession precedents. The final siege of Palermo reads like an accounting exercise, competing claims evaluated through military audit, with the crown awarded to whoever can provide the most convincing combination of legal argument and armed force. The next fall is moral, because the Church says it is. Benevento, 1266. The battlefield stinks of steel and sanctified violence. Pope Urban IV's crusade against the viper brood of Hohenstaufen reaches its theological conclusion. Not just military defeat, but moral condemnation that erases a dynasty from Christian history. The morning begins with Mass celebrated in both camps, but the prayers are different. Charles of Anjou's chaplains invoke divine justice against heretical usurpers. Manfred's priests bless the defense of legitimate inheritance. Same God, competing jurisdictions, military resolution of theological disputes. The official story is papal justice triumphant, condemned usurper destroyed by righteous force, church authority vindicated through military intervention blessed by heaven, order restored to Sicily through elimination of heretical bloodline. But the reality beneath crusading rhetoric reveals how papal politics turns dynastic elimination into religious doctrine. Manfred doesn't just lose a battle, he's pre-condemned through ecclesiastical legal theory that makes his very existence a sin against divine order. The papal condemnation categories treat his rule not as political mistake, but as metaphysical error requiring correction through violence. Pope Clement IV's bulls reveal the sophisticated machinery of theological warfare. The language escalates systematically. Excommunication, interdiction, crusade declaration, confiscation of temporal authority, and finally, deposition from all earthly dignity. Each step follows canonical procedure while serving political calculation. The evidence survives in papal bulls that construct elaborate theological justifications for what amounts to political assassination. The language matters. Manfred isn't killed in battle. He's destroyed as an enemy of Christ. His supporters aren't captured. They're purified through righteous judgment. His dynasty isn't conquered. It's cleansed from the earth as an offense to divine authority. Manfred's crime is genealogical as much as political. The papal correspondence describes the Hohenstaufen bloodline itself as corrupted. Not just Frederick II's illegitimate son, but heir to a dynasty that had systematically opposed papal authority for 3 generations. The condemnation becomes hereditary, making Manfred's birth evidence of his guilt. This is where medieval political theory reaches its most terrifying sophistication. Ecclesiastical law that converts murder into moral necessity. The Church doesn't just bless Charles of Anjou's invasion, it commands it as religious obligation. Killing Manfred becomes a sacramental act. Extinguishing his bloodline becomes a theological requirement. The Crusade indulgences offer spiritual rewards for military service. Full remission of sins for anyone who takes the cross against the Hohenstaufen. Manfred's destruction becomes pathway to salvation. His armies face enemies who believe they're earning heaven through battlefield. Slaughter. Confiscation logic works through religious categories. Manfred's lands weren't stolen. They were liberated from illegitimate occupation by condemned heretics. His treasury wasn't looted. It was recovered for righteous use by legitimate Christian authority. His castles weren't conquered. They were reclaimed from usurpers who had no right to hold Christian territory. The papal correspondence demonstrates how spiritual authority manufactures political reality. Excommunication documents that strip legal personality from living persons. Interdiction orders that make entire regions legally uninhabitable. And confiscation writs that transfer property through theological rather than secular jurisdiction. Charles of Anjou receives Sicily not as conquest prize, but as papal gift. The crown transferred through ecclesiastical authority that treats kingdoms like benefices requiring proper spiritual oversight. The legal fiction is meticulous. Charles doesn't invade Sicily. He inherits it through papal grant, validated by God's judgment, expressed through military victory. Contemporary chroniclers reveal the administrative efficiency of this theological revolution. Matthew Paris describes how papal documents arrive at European courts before the battle, announcing Manfred's death and Charles's succession as if reporting completed business rather than uncertain military venture. Picture the final scene. A battlefield where the dead king's body is denied Christian burial, his bloodline declared extinct through papal decree, and his kingdom transferred to new management through documents that treat conquest as divine correction of an obvious error. The corpse receives no royal funeral, no tomb marked with Hohenstaufen arms, no prayers for a Christian soul. The dynasty dies spiritually before it dies politically, excommunicated from Christian community, erased from sacred memory as well as secular record. And then there's the quieter ending. No battle, just nowhere, Senlis, 987. A hunting accident that couldn't have been more convenient if it had been scheduled by committee. The last Carolingian king dies without heirs, and suddenly France discovers it's been preparing for elective monarchy all along. The morning begins with royal sport. Louis V pursuing wild boar through the forests near Senlis. Contemporary accounts describe the hunt as routine entertainment, but the political context suggests nothing about this death as accidental. The king's childless state had been obvious for months. The succession crisis had been brewing since Charles the Simple's failed restoration attempts. The official story speaks of continuity. Natural death, lawful succession process, nobles choosing wisely for realm's stability. Louis V's death becomes opportunity for constitutional evolution, from hereditary principle to selective representation, from family property to institutional responsibility. But the reality beneath that smooth transition reveals how childless death triggers legitimacy, reconstruction, and how elective mechanics disguise predetermined outcomes. The selection of Hugh Capet looks like democratic process but functions as administrative formality. The choice was made before the voting began. Richer of Saint-Remy provides the most detailed account of the succession process, but his narrative reveals more about political management than constitutional procedure. The assembly at Senlis doesn't debate between multiple candidates. It ratifies a decision already negotiated through preliminary consultations that excluded inconvenient alternatives. The evidence lies in succession narratives that emphasize consensus while carefully obscuring the preliminary negotiations that produced it. Elite endorsements that sound spontaneous but follow suspicious geographic and political patterns. chronicle accounts that describe election excitement while downplaying the military preparations that made wrong choices impossible. Archbishop Adalberon of Reims delivers the crucial speech justifying Capetian selection. But his arguments reveal sophisticated constitutional innovation disguised as traditional principle. He argues that nobility should choose the most capable candidate rather than simply inherit the crown through blood. Revolutionary political theory presented as ancient wisdom. Here's the medieval political truth. When a dynasty ends naturally, the succession doesn't remain vacant pending divine intervention. It gets filled through human management that disguises itself as providential selection. The Capetians don't accidentally inherit France. They engineer inheritance through systematic preparation that makes their rule look inevitable in hindsight. The administrative machinery reveals the operation. Judicial precedents that favor Capetian legal interpretations. Episcopal appointments that ensure ecclesiastical support. Marriage alliances that create regional power bases, and military preparations that make resistance expensive for potential competitors. Hugh Capet's election appears consensual because dissent had been systematically eliminated before the assembly convened. Charles of Lorraine, the obvious Carolingian alternative, had been marginalized through careful political isolation. His supporters had been bought, intimidated, or convinced that opposition was futile. Economic evidence demonstrates how thoroughly the Capetians had prepared for this transition. Land grants, administrative appointments, and military commands show systematic construction of power base that made Capetian succession look like natural evolution rather than political revolution. Louis V's death eliminates one possibility: Carolingian continuation. But it doesn't determine what replaces it. That determination happens through political work that gets retrospectively described as divine guidance or natural evolution. The coronation ceremony at Noyon demonstrates this constitutional innovation's sophistication. Hugh Capet receives royal anointing not as inherited right but as electoral mandate. The sacred rituals remain identical while the underlying political theory transforms completely, from hereditary monarchy to elective kingship disguised as traditional succession. Contemporary German sources describe the French succession crisis with interest bordering on alarm. The Holy Roman Empire's chroniclers understand that elective monarchy in France threatens hereditary principle everywhere. If crowns become negotiable, every dynasty becomes vulnerable. Picture the deliberations. Nobles gathering to choose a king while armed. Capetian supporters ensure that only one choice looks prudent. The election ceremony that ratifies decisions made in private negotiations. The coronation that presents political victory as spiritual confirmation. The Capetian dynasty that emerges from this managed succession will rule France for 8 centuries, but its foundation rests on constitutional revolution disguised as natural evolution. Hugh Capet becomes king not through blood, but through political engineering sophisticated enough to make revolution look like restoration. Next, a throne where an assassination becomes a vacancy sale. Olomouc, 1306. A young king dies in his bedroom, and suddenly multiple kingdoms are for sale to whoever can construct the most convincing legal claim and deploy the most impressive military backing. The night begins quietly. Wenceslaus III retires to his chambers after routine court business, judicial hearings, administrative appointments, diplomatic correspondence. 26 years old, King of Bohemia and Poland, heir to Hungary through his father's claims. By morning, he's dead. and Central Europe discovers that a single assassination can transform 3 kingdoms into international real estate opportunities. The official story speaks of sudden tragedy. Promising young rulers struck down by assassination. Kingdoms thrown into crisis requiring international management. Noble houses stepping forward to provide necessary stability during dangerous transition. But the reality reveals how the vacuum becomes a marketplace where succession turns into commodity trading, and how claims multiply overnight when central authority disappears. Wenceslaus III's death doesn't just eliminate a king. It creates multiple throne vacancies simultaneously, as his holdings fragment into separate inheritance problems. The Chronica Paulinorum describes the immediate aftermath with bureaucratic precision. The king being dead, all his lands fell into confusion, and many claimed authority. The language is telling, not mourned or grieved, but claimed authority. Death creates opportunity more than tragedy. The evidence survives in the claim documents themselves. Elaborate genealogical arguments that trace rights through increasingly remote relationships, marriage contracts that suddenly become territorial justifications, and papal correspondence that treats kingdoms like disputed benefices requiring ecclesiastical arbitration. Within months, the competing claims read like a legal conference. Rudolf III of Bavaria, through his marriage to Wenceslaus's sister, Henry of Carinthia through complex Habsburg genealogies, Władysław Łokietek through Polish noble support, and Charles Robert of Anjou through Hungarian precedent. Each claim would satisfy university canon lawyers. Each claim requires military validation. Here's where medieval succession theory meets raw opportunism. A single assassination can trigger decades of wars because legitimate inheritance becomes an intellectual puzzle with military solutions. Everyone discovers previously unknown legal claims. Everyone finds previously overlooked canonical justifications. Everyone develops suddenly urgent moral obligations to restore proper order through armed intervention. The papal correspondence reveals the sophisticated machinery of succession management. Pope Clement V doesn't just recognize claimants. He creates claimants through legal interpretation that treats kingdoms like vacant benefices, requiring ecclesiastical appointment. The Pope's letters describe Hungary as lacking pastoral care and Poland as requiring spiritual guidance. Language that converts political vacuum into religious problem requiring papal solution. Poland, Hungary, and Bohemia. 3 kingdoms, dozens of claimants, infinite opportunities for creative legal reasoning. The Przemyslid dynasty doesn't just end. It explodes into competing inheritance fragments that require international conference to sort out. The economic evidence demonstrates how thoroughly succession crises become business opportunities. Italian bankers provide loans secured against future kingdom revenues. German merchants negotiate trade privileges contingent on succession outcomes. French nobility purchase military equipment for campaigns justified through genealogical arguments that would embarrass professional historians. Later chronicles note the beneficiaries with suspicious frequency. Noble houses that gain territory. Church institutions that acquire new privileges. Foreign kings who suddenly possess legitimate claims to intervene in Central European succession disputes. The assassination victim becomes footnote to the redistribution opportunities his death creates. The administrative documents reveal the systematic nature of this opportunism. Charter collections show how local nobles switch allegiances based on which claimant offers better terms. Military recruitment records demonstrate how succession disputes become employment opportunities for professional soldiers. Diplomatic correspondence treats Wenceslaus's kingdoms like investment portfolios requiring new management. This is where dynasty extinction reveals its most cynical mechanics. A dead king with questionable succession becomes a business opportunity for everyone with legal imagination and military resources. The curse isn't supernatural judgment. It's institutional opportunism disguised as succession crisis requiring external solution. Contemporary sources describe the confusion with mixture of excitement and alarm. The C.I. Annales Pragenses note, "Many kings arose in many lands, each claiming right through law, but ruling through sword." The observation is clinical. Succession has become entrepreneurial activity rather than constitutional process. And when foreign leverage arrives, it doesn't knock, it inherits. Or Buddha, 1301. The Arpad dynasty, 4 centuries of Hungarian rule, ends with Andrew III's death, and suddenly Hungary becomes available for international management by anyone who can provide genealogical paperwork and military enforcement. January 14th, 1301. The last Arpad king dies without male heirs, and the Hungarian nobility faces what amounts to a constitutional crisis disguised as inheritance mathematics. The Golden Bull of 1222 had established procedures for noble resistance to royal tyranny. But nobody had written instructions for what happens when the royal line simply ends naturally. The official narrative speaks of rightful end of a line. Ancient dynasty completing its providential course. Realm opening to new possibilities. Foreign houses with legitimate claims stepping forward to provide necessary continuity during dangerous transition. But the reality underneath reveals how succession becomes diplomatic currency when bloodlines end naturally, and how everyone claims to be the solution when nobody can prove they're the problem. Andrew III dies without male heirs, and suddenly half of Europe discovers previously unknown Hungarian connections. The Chronica Hungarorum describes the immediate aftermath with telling precision. The death of King Andrew opened the kingdom to many claimants, each bearing arms with genealogies. The juxtaposition is deliberate. Legal arguments require military enforcement when constitutional precedents fail to provide clear guidance. The evidence lies in marriage ties that get reinterpreted as territorial claims, papal correspondence that treats Hungary like disputed benefice requiring external arbitration, and charters that justify foreign intervention through increasingly creative genealogical reasoning. Multiple claimants construct plausible legal arguments. Charles Robert of Anjou, through his grandmother Mary of Hungary's Arpad bloodline. Wenceslaus III of Bohemia through conquest rights and papal recognition. Otto III of Bavaria through his mother's Hungarian connections. Each legal theory would pass academic scrutiny. Each political claim requires military enforcement. Charles Roberts' claim demonstrates the sophistication of medieval succession law. His great-grandmother was Stephen V's daughter, making him Arpad descendant through female inheritance. Canonical law supports female transmission of royal blood. Hungarian constitutional tradition generally favors male succession, but doesn't explicitly prohibit female inheritance when male lines fail. Wenceslaus III's claim works through different legal mechanism. Papal recognition of his father's Hungarian title, combined with military occupation of northwestern Hungarian territories. Legal possession validated through ecclesiastical authority, enforced through Bohemian military capability. Otto III counters through maternal inheritance claims reinforced by imperial support from his brother-in-law, Albert I of Germany. Habsburg backing provides international legitimacy that local Hungarian nobles can't ignore when choosing between competing foreign candidates. The papal correspondence reveals how ecclesiastical authority manages this succession marketplace. Pope Boniface VIII's letters treat Hungarian succession like vacant benefice requiring papal appointment, with political consideration disguised as spiritual oversight. The Pope doesn't just recognize claims, he creates claims through legal interpretation. Hungary doesn't fall to conquest, it falls to inheritance mathematics. When the native dynasty ends, legitimate succession becomes intellectual puzzle with armed solutions. The kingdom becomes available to whoever can provide the most convincing combination of legal argument, papal blessing, and military capability. The economic evidence demonstrates how thoroughly succession disputes become international business opportunities. Venetian loans finance Charles Roberts' Hungarian campaign. Florentine bankers provide credit secured against future Hungarian revenues. German merchants negotiate trade privileges contingent on succession outcomes. The subsequent wars of succession demonstrate how dynasties end, but kingdoms continue through management transfer. The conflicts rage from 1301 to 1310, with competing kings controlling different regions simultaneously. Hungary fragments into competing administrations, each claiming exclusive legitimacy while exercising partial authority. Administrative documents reveal the systematic nature of this transition. Charter witness lists show how Hungarian nobles calculate allegiances based on military prospects rather than genealogical preferences. Papal letters describe Hungarian territories like disputed dioceses, requiring ecclesiastical arbitration, and diplomatic correspondence treats the Hungarian succession like international legal problem requiring foreign solution. Andrew III's death doesn't eliminate Hungary. It creates Hungary as international property requiring external ownership through legitimate inheritance claims. The Arpad dynasty ends, but Hungarian kingdom continues under foreign management that treats native constitutional traditions as administrative details rather than fundamental law. Which brings us to a fall that starts with a horse ride. Kinghorn, March 19, 1286. A stormy night, a dangerous ride, a king's horse missing the clifftop path. Alexander III dies in what looks like pure accident. But accidents have consequences, and this particular accident will end Scottish independence for decades. The evening begins with royal council at Edinburgh Castle. Alexander III announces his intention to ride to Kinghorn despite the weather, ostensibly to join his new wife, Yolande of Dreux, but possibly to assert royal prerogative against nobles who question his judgment. Contemporary chroniclers describe the ride as impulsive, but the political context suggests deeper motives. The official narrative presents tragic misfortune. Beloved king killed by natural disaster. Realm thrown into crisis requiring careful management. Guardianship councils stepping forward to protect royal inheritance during dangerous minority. But the reality beneath that surface reveals how guardianship politics create opportunities for external pressure, and how rival claims multiply when central authority disappears. Alexander's death creates a succession crisis that becomes an invitation for English intervention, disguised as fraternal assistance. The Chronicle of Lanercost provides crucial details about the ride itself. The king insisted on traveling despite his counselor's warnings, dismissed his escort at the fourth crossing, and rode alone into the storm. The ferrymaster at Queensferry reportedly warned against the crossing, but Alexander pressed forward with what witnesses described as unusual determination. The accident occurs near Kinghorn, where the cliff-top path overlooks the Forth. Alexander's horse stumbles in the darkness, throwing the king onto the rocks below. His body is discovered at dawn by search parties who had been tracking his route since he failed to arrive at Kinghorn Manor. Death appears instantaneous, but timing couldn't be more politically devastating. The evidence lies in guardianship records that show how protection becomes control. Treaty mechanisms that convert temporary arrangements into permanent subordination, and diplomatic correspondence that treats Scottish independence as negotiable commodity rather than natural fact. The succession crisis unfolds with mechanical precision. Alexander's heir is his granddaughter Margaret, the 3-year-old Maid of Norway. A child queen creates immediate guardianship problems that become constitutional opportunities for anyone with legal imagination and military resources. The ragman roll documents how systematically Edward I converts assistants into overlordship. The initial arrangements appear reasonable. English arbitration of Scottish succession disputes, temporary military support for guardianship council, marriage arrangements between Margaret and the future Edward II to prevent future succession crises. The Maid of Norway's death in 1290 eliminates the direct heir, creating what amounts to franchise opportunity for anyone who can construct plausible genealogical claims. Edward I doesn't invade Scotland. He arbitrates between competing candidates, then inherits overlordship through the arbitration process itself. This is where medieval political theory becomes genuinely insidious. Assistance during succession crises that creates permanent dependency relationships. Edward's intervention looks like neighborly help, resolving Scottish inheritance disputes through impartial adjudication. The result is Scottish monarchy that exists through English permission rather than inherent right. The Great Cause hearings of 1291 to 1292 demonstrate how legal arbitration converts independence into colonial status. Scottish succession becomes English legal problem requiring English judicial solution enforced through English military guarantee. John Balliol receives the Scottish crown through English authority, making him Scottish king and English vassal simultaneously. The legal machinery is sophisticated. Edward claims overlordship through ancient feudal relationships that had been largely ceremonial, then enforces those claims through judicial authority that makes resistance look like rebellion against lawful superior, rather than defense of Scottish independence. Contemporary Scottish sources reveal growing awareness that arbitration has become occupation. The Chronicle of Melrose notes, "The realm of Scotland was placed under the lordship of the King of England, not by conquest, but by law." The distinction proves meaningless when law serves conquest. Picture the ceremony. A Scottish king crowned through English authorization, swearing homage to English overlord for kingdom he supposedly inherits by right. The independence that Alexander III ruled by divine sanction becomes dependency that John Balliol holds through English permission. Now, watch sovereignty become negotiable through unions. Oslo, 1319. The last Fairhair king dies without sons, and Norway discovers it's been evolving toward union monarchy all along. What looks like dynastic crisis becomes constitutional opportunity, the end of one tradition and the beginning of another. May 8th, 1319. King Haakon V dies, leaving Norway's crown to his 3-year-old grandson Magnus through his daughter Ingeborg's marriage to Duke Erik of Sweden. The succession appears straightforward. Royal blood flows through legitimate female inheritance to legitimate male heir. But inheritance through female lines creates constitutional opportunities that transform independent monarchy into collaborative administration. The official story presents orderly transition, natural evolution toward Scandinavian unity, wise adaptation to political realities, constitutional development that strengthens rather than weakens Norwegian royal authority through international alliance. But the reality reveals how unions tighten when male lines fail, and how autonomy becomes conditional when succession requires external management. Hakon's daughter inherits, but inheritance through female lines creates opportunities for constitutional reinterpretation that transform independent monarchy into collaborative administration. The Annales Norvegici describe the succession council's deliberations with telling detail. Norwegian nobles accept Magnus's inheritance while negotiating administrative arrangements that preserve Norwegian dignity within Swedish oversight. The language is diplomatic, but the substance is subordination disguised as partnership. The evidence survives in succession acts that carefully preserve Norwegian distinctiveness while establishing Swedish oversight, diplomatic texts that describe union while documenting subordination, and administrative records that show how separate kingdoms become departments of international management structure. Magnus VII's coronation demonstrates this constitutional innovation's sophistication. He receives separate crowns in separate ceremonies. Norwegian king in Nidaros, Swedish king in Stockholm. But the dual monarchy privileges Swedish administrative systems and Swedish political priorities. Norwegian royal dignity survives, while Norwegian political autonomy disappears into joint institutions. The Kalmar Union doesn't conquer Norway. It absorbs Norway through constitutional evolution that makes independence look obsolete. Magnus VII rules both Norway and Sweden, but the administrative reality favors Swedish precedents when joint decisions require unified policy. Norway becomes junior partner in marriage that was supposed to be equal partnership. Economic evidence reveals how thoroughly union arrangements favor Swedish interests. Tax collection systems adopt Swedish administrative models. Military organization integrates Norwegian forces into Swedish command structures. Trade policies reflect Swedish commercial priorities while treating Norwegian economic interests as regional concerns requiring accommodation rather than constitutional protection. The diplomatic correspondence demonstrates how union monarchy creates institutional dependence that makes separation increasingly difficult. Norwegian foreign policy becomes a subset of Swedish foreign policy. Norwegian military resources serve Swedish strategic priorities. Norwegian noble careers require Swedish court connections for advancement opportunities. This demonstrates how medieval dynasties end through administrative efficiency rather than military conquest. No battles, no assassinations, no dramatic deposition ceremonies. Just constitutional adjustments that make separate kingship unnecessary when union kingship works better for international political requirements. Contemporary sources reveal Norwegian noble ambivalence about this transformation. The Historia Norvegiae notes, "The realm retained its name and laws, but governance followed Swedish custom." The preservation of dignity while losing substance becomes recurring theme in union arrangements that prioritize diplomatic convenience over constitutional independence. Magnus VII doesn't steal the Norwegian crown. He inherits it through legitimate succession, then integrates it into larger political framework that makes Norwegian independence a luxury neither kingdom can afford. The dynasty ends, but the kingship continues through institutional merger that treats Norwegian distinctiveness as administrative detail rather than fundamental constitutional principle. The legal machinery reveals how thoroughly this constitutional transformation was managed through existing institutional structures. Norwegian law codes remain technically valid, while Swedish administrative precedents determine practical implementation. Norwegian noble titles retain ceremonial significance, while Swedish officials exercise operational authority. Picture the final transformation. Norwegian royal seals used to authorize documents written according to Swedish administrative procedures. Norwegian noble councils that deliberate policies predetermined by Swedish royal councils. Norwegian royal dignity preserved through ceremonial recognition, while Norwegian royal authority evaporates into joint institutions. Next, a dynasty ends peacefully, and the paperwork does the killing. Krakow, 1370. The king who rebuilt Poland dies without male heirs, leaving a modernized kingdom ready for international management by whoever can provide the most sophisticated legal arguments and administrative capabilities. November 5th, 1370. King Casimir III dies, and Poland faces what amounts to an inheritance paradox. The most successful Piast ruler has created a kingdom too valuable to remain under Piast control. His domestic achievements become the argument for foreign succession, rather than the foundation for dynastic continuation. The official story speaks of prosperity, reform, and legacy. Great kings' achievements preserved through wise succession planning. Realm opening to new possibilities through foreign marriage alliance, constitutional evolution that strengthens Poland through connection to Hungarian royal authority. But the reality underneath reveals how inheritance law outlives achievement, and how dynasties end regardless of their success in strengthening kingdoms. Casimir's domestic accomplishments make Poland more attractive to foreign inheritors, but they don't preserve Piast dynasty control over Polish political development. The Chronicon Olivens describes the immediate succession crisis with administrative precision. The king being dead without male issue, the realm fell to foreign lordship through matrimonial right, but continued in prosperity through wise governance. The language reveals everything: continuity of administration, discontinuity of dynasty. The evidence lies in succession statutes that privilege female inheritance when male lines fail, noble agreements that accept foreign rule through legitimate succession rather than conquest, and international treaties that treat kingdoms like matrimonial property transferable through appropriate legal mechanisms. Casimir's succession law of 1355 had established female inheritance rights specifically to prevent succession crises. But the law creates precisely the crisis it was designed to avoid. His daughters can inherit, but their foreign marriages make Polish inheritance international property, requiring external management. Louis I of Hungary inherits Poland through his mother Elizabeth's Polish claims. She was Casimir's sister, making Louis legitimate Piast heir through female inheritance. The genealogical argument is flawless. The political consequences are devastating for Polish autonomy. The administrative transition reveals how thoroughly successful kingdoms become attractive targets for international management. Hungarian officials arrive in Krakow with detailed knowledge of Polish administrative systems. Hungarian legal experts provide constitutional interpretations that preserve Polish dignity while establishing Hungarian oversight. Hungarian military commanders offer security arrangements that make Polish independence redundant. Louis I of Hungary inherits Poland through his mother's Polish claims, making him king of both kingdoms while residing primarily in Hungary and governing Poland through Hungarian administrative systems. Poland doesn't lose independence. It gains Hungarian management through legitimate succession that makes separate administration redundant. The economic evidence demonstrates how Casimir's reforms become arguments for foreign rule. Modernized tax collection systems that produce revenues attractive to international management. Judicial reforms that create institutional stability valuable for foreign investment. Military improvements that provide security guarantees useful for regional strategic planning. This reveals the ultimate medieval political irony. Successful kingdoms become attractive inheritance targets, and effective dynasties end through their own success in creating valuable political assets. Casimir's reforms make Poland worth inheriting, ensuring that his death will trigger international competition for Polish succession rights. The papal correspondence treats Polish succession like administrative transfer requiring ecclesiastical validation. Pope Gregory XI's letters describe the Hungarian inheritance as providential arrangement that strengthens Christian governance in Eastern Europe. The spiritual authority legitimizes political convenience. Contemporary sources reveal Polish noble ambivalence about this transformation. The Annales Długosze note, the realm gained a king but lost a dynasty, gained security but lost autonomy. The trade-offs are explicitly acknowledged. Immediate benefits, long-term subordination. The Piast dynasty ends not through failure, but through achievement that outlives the achievers. Poland continues, stronger and richer than before, but under management that treats Polish distinctiveness as administrative detail rather than constitutional necessity. Picture the final ceremony. Casimir III's funeral procession through Krakow streets lined with architectural monuments to his reign, followed by Louis I's coronation, using the same crown to authorize Hungarian administration of Polish territories. Success and extinction intertwined in a single ceremonial sequence. The pattern deepens, because now the holy language becomes openly punitive. Vincennes, 1328. The last direct Capetian king dies without male heirs, and France discovers it needs new inheritance laws to prevent English management of French political development. Constitutional crisis becomes constitutional opportunity, but only if you're writing the Constitution. February 1st, 1328. Charles IV's death without male issue triggers what appears to be routine succession crisis, but functions as constitutional revolution disguised as legal discovery. The immediate question, who inherits France, becomes opportunity to rewrite fundamental law through creative interpretation that serves contemporary political necessity. The official story presents lawful decision preventing chaos, wise legal interpretation that preserves French independence, constitutional development that strengthens monarchy through clarification of succession principles, judicial reasoning that prevents foreign interference in French domestic governance. But the reality reveals how rules get interpreted to sideline rivals, and how legal precedent gets manufactured when political necessity requires constitutional innovation. The Salic law that excludes Edward III's claims through his mother Isabel doesn't exist as formal constitutional principle until the succession crisis makes it necessary. the legal machinery reveals sophisticated constitutional manipulation. Edward III's claim through Isabel of France is genealogically impeccable. Daughter of Philip IV, sister of 3 French kings, aunt of the current claimant Philip VI. Medieval inheritance law generally recognizes female transmission of royal blood. Canon law supports inheritance through female lines when male lines fail. But Philip VI's supporters discover ancient Frankish legal traditions that supposedly prohibit female inheritance of royal authority. The Salic law gets excavated from Carolingian legal collections, dusted off, and presented as fundamental constitutional principle that had been temporarily forgotten during recent succession crises. The evidence lies in legal argumentation that retroactively creates precedents, succession precedent building that transforms administrative convenience into fundamental law, and judicial reasoning that treats political necessity as constitutional discovery rather than constitutional invention. Contemporary chroniclers reveal the manufactured nature of this constitutional innovation. Jean Froissart describes how legal scholars found in ancient books laws that conveniently solved contemporary political problems. The discovery looks suspiciously like invention designed to justify predetermined outcomes. Philip VI doesn't steal the French throne. He inherits it through legal interpretation that makes Edward III's claims constitutionally invalid. But the legal interpretation is created specifically to invalidate Edward's claims, making the constitutional reasoning circular. Edward can't inherit because the law prevents it, and the law prevents it because Edward can't be allowed to inherit. The administrative documents demonstrate how thoroughly this constitutional revolution was managed through existing institutional structures. Royal councils issue legal opinions that treat new interpretations as ancient wisdom. University scholars provide academic validation for political necessity. Church authorities offer canonical support for expedient constitutional innovation. This is where medieval political theory meets sophisticated legal manipulation. Constitutional principles that emerge from political requirements rather than traditional precedent. France doesn't just reject English claims. It develops a legal theory that makes English claims impossible in principle rather than merely undesirable in practice. The economic implications reveal why constitutional innovation was politically necessary. English inheritance of France would create unified Anglo-French monarchy that could dominate European politics for centuries. French legal innovation prevents that outcome through constitutional barriers that make future English claims theoretically invalid, rather than just practically difficult. The subsequent 100 Years' War demonstrates how constitutional innovation creates military obligations. Edward III doesn't just claim the French throne through genealogical right. He challenges the constitutional theory that excludes genealogical inheritance through female lines. The war becomes legal argument conducted through military means. Parliamentary records show how legal innovation gets institutionalized through administrative routine. The Parlement of Paris issues judicial decisions that treat Salic law as established constitutional principle. Royal Chancery documents reference female inheritance prohibition as traditional French law. University curriculum incorporates new legal theory into standard constitutional instruction. Picture the constitutional moment. French legal scholars discovering ancient laws that solve contemporary problems. Royal counselors presenting legal innovation as constitutional restoration. Political necessity disguised as scholarly research that happens to justify predetermined outcomes. and when law can be bent, it becomes a blade. Lisbon, 1383. King Ferdinand dies, and his marriage contract becomes the fuse that explodes Portuguese independence into fragments requiring reassembly through military arbitration and diplomatic negotiation. October 22nd, 1383. Ferdinand's death triggers what appears to be straightforward dynastic succession, but functions as constitutional crisis disguised as inheritance dispute. The immediate question, who rules Portugal, becomes opportunity for political reinvention through constitutional innovation that privileges national independence over genealogical accuracy. The official story speaks of smooth succession, lawful inheritance through royal marriage, legitimate claims requiring international recognition, temporary instability resolved through appropriate legal mechanisms and foreign assistance. But the reality reveals how a treaty clause becomes dynastic time bomb, and how marriage contracts written for diplomatic convenience create succession crises that require military solutions. Ferdinand's daughter Beatrice inherits Portugal, but she's married to John I of Castile, making Portugal's succession a Castilian family matter. The marriage had seemed diplomatically brilliant when negotiated in 1382. Portuguese-Castilian alliance that would end decades of border warfare. Royal wedding that would create permanent peace between neighboring kingdoms. Dynastic union that would strengthen both realms against external threats. But the succession clause contains constitutional poison. Beatrice inherits Portugal, but her husband exercises royal authority during her lifetime. Portuguese independence survives through legal fiction, while disappearing through administrative reality. The crown remains Portuguese, while governance becomes Castilian. The evidence survives in treaty texts that reveal how marriage negotiations privilege diplomatic utility over succession stability, faction chronicles that demonstrate how inheritance disputes become civil wars, and diplomatic correspondence that treats kingdoms like matrimonial property requiring external management. Portuguese nobles recognize the trap immediately. John I of Castile doesn't just claim Portugal through his wife. He claims it as inheritance that makes Portuguese independence redundant. The marriage that was supposed to preserve Portuguese autonomy becomes mechanism for its elimination through legal subterfuge. The resistance movement emerges from unexpected quarters, urban populations, minor nobility, and church officials who understand that Castilian inheritance means Portuguese absorption. The Master of Aviz, John of Aviz, becomes focal point for opposition that treats genealogical succession as less important than national independence. The 1383 to 1385 interregnum demonstrates how succession crises become opportunities for constitutional reinvention. Portugal doesn't just choose a new king. It chooses a new type of kingship through the Cortes of Coimbra, which elevates John of Aviz through election rather than strict hereditary succession. The Cortes of Coimbra in 1385 creates constitutional precedent that will influence Portuguese governance for centuries. Elective monarchy disguised as hereditary succession, parliamentary authorization that validates dynastic innovation, National Assembly that treats independence as more legitimate than genealogical inheritance. This reveals how dynasties end through constitutional evolution. The Burgundy dynasty's Portuguese branch doesn't lose political authority through conquest. It loses through legal interpretation that treats elective succession as more legitimate than inherited claims when inherited claims threaten national independence. Beatrice remains legitimate heir through genealogical reasoning, but legitimacy becomes insufficient when genealogical inheritance conflicts with political independence. The new Aviz dynasty begins through parliamentary authorization rather than family succession, making John I the first Portuguese king whose authority derives from institutional choice rather than hereditary right. The military campaigns of 1385 to 1411 demonstrate how constitutional innovation requires armed enforcement. The Battle of Al-Jubarota doesn't just defeat Castilian invasion, it validates Portuguese constitutional revolution through military verdict that makes elective monarchy look like divine judgment. Contemporary sources reveal Portuguese awareness that constitutional innovation was preserving national identity through legal revolution. The Chronicle of John I describes the Cortes of Coimbra as restoration of ancient Portuguese liberties rather than constitutional innovation, but the substance is clearly revolutionary. Which brings us to a crown that survives by inventing legitimacy, Caspi, 1412. The crown of Aragon sits vacant for 2 years, while legal experts debate succession rights with the thoroughness of property lawyers dividing an estate. Medieval monarchy discovers it can function like a business transaction when nobody has obvious inheritance claims. May 31st, 1410. Martin I dies without legitimate heirs, and the Crown of Aragon confronts what amounts to constitutional crisis disguised as genealogical puzzle. The immediate question, who inherits the crown, becomes opportunity for political experimentation that treats monarchy like elective office requiring academic arbitration. The official story presents stability preserved, careful legal reasoning that protects realm from civil war, wise arbitration that respects traditional principles while adapting to contemporary realities, constitutional process that strengthens monarchy through clarified succession procedures. But the reality reveals how negotiated selection exposes the crown as institutional, property rather than family inheritance, and how rightful succession becomes intellectual exercise with predetermined political outcomes. The Compromise of Caspi doesn't discover the legitimate heir. It manufactures legitimacy through legal reasoning that justifies political necessity. The 2-year interregnum demonstrates how thoroughly medieval monarchies could function without kings when institutional systems were sufficiently developed. The Crown of Aragon continues governing itself through existing administrative structures, while legal experts debate succession rights with scholarly thoroughness. The evidence survives in records of arbitration that read like legal briefs, rather than genealogical research, noble frameworks that privilege political stability over hereditary claims, and constitutional precedents that treat kingship like elective office when hereditary succession produces inconvenient results. Multiple claimants construct plausible legal arguments. James II of Urgell through legitimate descent from Peter IV, Louis III of Anjou through royal connections and French support, Ferdinand of Antequera through Castilian backing and papal recognition. Each claim would satisfy traditional inheritance principles under different interpretational frameworks. The Compromise of Caspi establishes unprecedented constitutional procedure. 9 arbitrators, 3 each from Aragon, Catalonia, and Valencia, will evaluate competing claims through scholarly analysis rather than military arbitration. Medieval monarchy becomes academic exercise requiring intellectual rather than armed resolution. The arbitration process reveals a sophisticated understanding of how legitimacy can be manufactured through legal procedure. Each claimant receives formal hearing, where genealogical arguments are evaluated like university disputations. Legal scholars provide expert testimony, treating succession law like academic discipline, requiring scholarly interpretation. The 9. Arbitrators don't just choose between candidates. They choose between constitutional theories, strict hereditary succession, modified hereditary succession with political considerations, or elective monarchy disguised as arbitrated inheritance. Their selection of Ferdinand reveals which theory serves contemporary political requirements. Ferdinand of Antequera's victory demonstrates how medieval succession law functions as political technology. His genealogical claim is weaker than James of Urgel's, but his political backing is stronger. The arbitrators award the crown to the candidate who can provide the most convincing combination of legal argument and institutional support. This demonstrates how medieval succession law functions as political technology. Flexible enough to justify necessary outcomes, sophisticated enough to maintain legitimacy, and comprehensive enough to convert political victories into constitutional precedents. Ferdinand doesn't conquer Aragon. He inherits it through legal reasoning that makes his rule inevitable in hindsight. The constitutional innovation survives the particular succession crisis. The Compromise of Caspi creates precedent that monarchy can be elective when circumstances require institutional flexibility. The Crown of Aragon develops constitutional tradition that treats kingship like property requiring appropriate legal transfer procedures. Contemporary sources reveal widespread awareness that the compromise represents constitutional innovation disguised as constitutional restoration. The Chronicle of Peter IV describes the arbitration as recovery of ancient Aragonese liberties rather than constitutional experimentation, but the substance is clearly innovative. Now, watch what happens when an empire dissolves without a conquering army, somewhere in the Balkans. The location itself has become uncertain. The last Nemanjic emperor dies, and the Serbian Empire discovers it dissolved before anyone noticed. This is how dynasties end in the medieval world. Not through dramatic conquest, but through administrative evaporation. December 4th, 1371. Stefan Uroš V dies in circumstances that epitomize his reign. Precise date, uncertain location, minimal political impact. The Emperor of Serbs and Greeks rules an empire that exists primarily in imperial titles and administrative documents, while real authority operates through regional arrangements that don't require imperial participation. The official story speaks of weak ruler, natural decline, ineffective central authority gradually losing control to local power centers, realm naturally fragmenting into manageable regional units, imperial title becoming ceremonial recognition rather than active political authority. But the reality reveals how decentralization becomes irreversible when central authority loses the ability to enforce unity, and how titles linger after power dies, creating ghost governments that exist on parchment while real authority operates through local arrangements. Stefan Uroš V calls himself emperor, while governing territory smaller than many provincial holdings. The administrative documents reveal the systematic nature of this imperial dissolution. Charter witness lists show how local nobles stop requesting imperial confirmation for their acts. Regional judicial decisions no longer reference imperial authority. Tax collection systems operate independently of central coordination. The empire continues functioning while bypassing the emperor. The evidence lies in charter fragmentation that shows how local nobles stop requesting imperial confirmation for their acts. Elite autonomy records that demonstrate how regional power centers begin conducting independent foreign policy, and documentary silence that reveals how imperial authority disappears from administrative routine. Stefan Uroš V's court becomes theatrical performance rather than governmental institution. Imperial ceremonies continue while imperial authority evaporates. The emperor issues edicts that nobody implements, makes appointments that nobody recognizes, and conducts diplomacy that nobody honors. Political irrelevance disguised as constitutional continuity. The Serbian Empire doesn't fall to foreign conquest. It dissolves through institutional failure that makes central coordination impossible to maintain. Local nobles don't rebel against imperial authority. They gradually stop acknowledging it as relevant to their political requirements. Contemporary sources describe this dissolution with mixture of confusion and pragmatic acceptance. The Chronicle of the Priest of Duklia notes how many lords arose in many lands, each governing according to his own counsel rather than imperial command. The observation is clinical. Central. Authority has become optional. This demonstrates the quietest form of dynasty extinction. Not assassination, conquest, or deposition, but irrelevance. Stefan Uroš V remains emperor until his death, but emperorship becomes theatrical performance rather than political reality. The title survives while the institution evaporates. The economic evidence demonstrates how thoroughly the empire had fragmented into autonomous units. Regional mints operate independently of imperial monetary policy. Trade agreements are negotiated directly between local authorities and foreign powers. Military recruitment occurs through regional rather than imperial command structures. Multiple successor states emerge from imperial fragmentation, independent principalities that claim legitimacy through regional authority rather than imperial inheritance, local dynasties that establish sovereignty through military capability rather than constitutional succession, and territorial lords who convert administrative appointments into hereditary possessions. The most telling evidence is diplomatic. Foreign powers stop addressing communications to the Serbian emperor and begin negotiating directly with regional authorities. The Byzantine Empire, Hungary, and emerging Ottoman power treat Stefan Uroš V like ceremonial figurehead while conducting substantive diplomacy with his former vassals. Picture the final scene. An emperor dying alone while his subjects govern themselves through arrangements that don't require imperial participation. The funeral that nobody attends because the participants are busy establishing their own kingdoms from the pieces of an empire that stopped functioning before it officially ended. Next is the brutal version. Capture, execution, and a line cut off. Nicopolis, 1395. The last Bulgarian Tsar dies in Ottoman captivity, and Bulgaria discovers that resistance becomes historical footnote when resistance occurs within larger imperial systems that treat local dynasties like administrative details requiring correction. The capture occurs not through dramatic battlefield confrontation, but through systematic military pressure that reduces Bulgarian independence to negotiated commodity. Ivan Shishman's final years demonstrate how medieval resistance operates when local dynasties encounter imperial systems that treat sovereignty like administrative efficiency problem requiring solution. The official story speaks of heroic fall, courageous ruler defending Christian Bulgaria against Islamic conquest, noble resistance crushed by superior force, martyrdom that preserves Bulgarian identity, even when Bulgarian independence becomes impossible to maintain. But the reality reveals how shrinking options force desperate diplomacy, and how the end arrives as policy rather than drama when local resistance becomes inconvenient for imperial administration. Ivan Shishman's execution isn't battlefield heroics. It's bureaucratic housekeeping that eliminates administrative complexity. The siege of Tarnovo in 1393 demonstrates how Ottoman conquest operates when imperial efficiency encounters local resistance. The capital falls not through dramatic assault, but through methodical reduction that makes continued resistance pointless. Bulgarian sovereignty dies through administrative strangulation rather than military catastrophe. The evidence survives in diplomatic references that show how Bulgarian independence becomes negotiated commodity rather than natural fact. Conquest administration records that treat Bulgarian resistance like regional rebellion requiring suppression, and Ottoman documentation that describes Tsar elimination as routine administrative procedure. Ivan Shishman's final diplomatic efforts reveal the systematic nature of Ottoman conquest strategy. Hungarian alliance negotiations fail because Hungary faces Ottoman pressure on multiple fronts. Wallachian marriage diplomacy collapses when Wallachia chooses Ottoman accommodation over Bulgarian solidarity. Papal appeals for crusade support generate spiritual encouragement, but no military assistance. Ivan Shishman doesn't lose because he's weak or his cause is unjust. He loses because Bulgarian independence conflicts with Ottoman imperial organization, and local dynasties don't survive when they become inconvenient for larger political systems. His resistance is authentic, but authenticity doesn't generate military capability sufficient to challenge imperial authority. The Ottoman approach to Balkan dynasties is methodical. Capture, imprisonment, execution when convenient, replacement with appointed governors who serve imperial rather than local political requirements. No dramatic battlefield confrontations, no ceremonial submissions, just administrative efficiency that converts independent kingdoms into Ottoman provinces. Ottoman administrative records treat Ivan Shishman's elimination with bureaucratic precision. The execution is documented as administrative procedure rather than political event. The Bulgarian territories are incorporated into Ottoman provincial system through standard conquest protocols. Former royal authority becomes regional administrative problem requiring routine imperial management. This reveals how medieval conquest functions when imperial systems encounter local resistance. Not negotiation or accommodation, but elimination of incompatible political structures through patient administrative pressure. The Ottomans don't defeat Bulgaria. They absorb Bulgaria by removing the elements that make Bulgarian independence possible. Contemporary Christian sources describe Ivan Shishman's death as martyrdom, but the administrative reality is more clinical. The Byzantine Chronicle of Laonikos, Chalco-Condyles, notes how Ottoman conquest operates through careful administration of local resistance until resistance becomes administratively irrelevant. Bulgarian identity survives Ivan Shishman's execution, but Bulgarian political independence disappears into imperial administration that treats former kingdoms like geographical expressions requiring management rather than political entities requiring negotiation. The ecclesiastical aftermath demonstrates how thoroughly Ottoman conquest eliminated Bulgarian institutional independence. Bulgarian Orthodox Church leadership is replaced with Ottoman-appointed bishops. Monastic properties are converted to imperial administrative uses. Church documents are archived in Ottoman provincial records rather than Bulgarian royal collections. And then there's the case where the crown becomes a trapdoor. Jajce, May 1463. The last king of Bosnia rules for 8 weeks before discovery that royal titles become meaningless when imperial powers decide local independence is administratively inconvenient. Medieval kingship without imperial backing becomes theatrical performance with fatal consequences. The official story speaks of swift conquest, efficient Ottoman administration removing obstacles to regional stability, legitimate imperial authority correcting artificial political boundaries, military necessity, eliminating sources of future rebellion through decisive action. But the reality reveals how alliances fail when imperial systems prioritize efficiency over local arrangements, and how legitimacy collapses under competing protections that convert assistance into occupation. Stephen Tomašević dies because Bosnia becomes a problem requiring solution rather than a kingdom requiring recognition. The evidence lies in treaty attempts that reveal how Bosnian independence required external guarantees from powers unwilling to provide military enforcement, papal appeals that demonstrate how spiritual authority becomes irrelevant when the temporal power makes different calculations, and conquest records that treat Bosnian resistance like administrative rebellion requiring suppression. Stephen Tomašević's reign demonstrates how medieval kingship functions when reduced to its essential elements: royal title, limited territory, uncertain succession, hostile neighbors, and no reliable allies. The kingdom exists through diplomatic courtesy that disappears when convenience requires elimination of administrative complexity. Hungary promises support but provides none. Venice offers trade relationships but no military assistance. The Pope grants spiritual recognition while remaining politically irrelevant to Ottoman military planning. Stephen becomes king of a diplomatic fiction that dissolves when Ottoman patience with Bosnian independence expires. The Siege of Jajce reveals how medieval conquest works when imperial efficiency encounters local resistance. Not prolonged warfare, but methodical elimination of political alternatives. The Ottomans don't just capture Bosnia. They eliminate Bosnia as a category of political organization that complicates imperial administration. Picture the final scene. A king beheaded after 8 weeks of rule, his kingdom converted into Ottoman province through administrative reorganization that treats former royal authority like regional rebellion requiring suppression. The crown that was supposed to preserve Bosnian independence becomes the justification for its elimination. We return to the West, where dynasties bleed out in public, then get rewritten. Tower of London, May 21st, 1471. The last Lancastrian king dies in custody, and England discovers that civil war produces documentation requirements. Official stories that convert political murder into administrative necessity sanctified by divine judgment. The evening begins with Edward IV's return to London after the Battle of Tewkesbury, bringing with him the captured Henry VI and the end of effective Lancastrian resistance. Within hours, the former king is dead in the Tower, and within days, the machinery of legitimation begins converting regicide into constitutional necessity. The official story presents Civil War resolution. Legitimate Yorkist authority eliminating pretender whose mental instability threatened realm stability. Divine providence supporting rightful dynasty through military victory blessed by heaven. Political order restored through elimination of factional conflict. But the reality beneath that narrative reveals how contested anointing becomes propaganda, battlefield, and how victors curate historical records to make their violence look like divine correction. Henry VI doesn't just die in the Tower. He gets posthumously tried through chronicle manipulation that converts political murder into moral necessity. The Yorkist chroniclers construct elaborate justifications for what amounts to political assassination. The official cause of death, melancholy and displeasure, becomes evidence of divine judgment rather than human intervention. Henry's mental episodes get reframed as proof that God had withdrawn his favor from the Lancastrian dynasty. The evidence lies in proclamations that justify Yorkist authority through Lancastrian delegitimization, parliamentary endorsements that retroactively validate conquest through constitutional reasoning, and chronicle bias mapping that reveals how historical writing serves political requirements rather than factual accuracy. Multiple versions of Henry VI's character emerge from contemporary sources. Saint-like innocent destroyed by political ambition. Mentally incompetent ruler whose disability justified removal. Legitimate king murdered by usurpers who required moral justification for their crimes. Each narrative serves specific political requirements. The Great Chronicle of London demonstrates this narrative flexibility by describing Henry as both holy man and insufficient king within the same document. The characterization depends on whether the chronicler is explaining Henry's spiritual virtues or justifying his political elimination. The Yorkist propaganda machinery is sophisticated. Henry's mental episodes become evidence of divine disfavor. His military defeats become proof of illegitimate authority. His religious devotion becomes weakness that threatened secular governance. The same characteristics get interpreted differently depending on political necessity. Parliamentary records reveal how systematically this propaganda campaign was institutionalized. Acts of resumption strip Lancastrian supporters of lands and titles, creating economic incentives for political loyalty. Succession statutes treat the Lancastrian reign as constitutional error, requiring correction rather than legitimate rule requiring recognition. This demonstrates how medieval chronicle writing functions as political technology. Narrative construction that makes necessary violence look like inevitable correction of obvious errors. The Wars of the Roses don't just determine who rules England, they determine what legitimate rule means through retroactive constitutional interpretation. Parliamentary records show how victory gets converted into legal precedent. Acts of attainder that declare defeated enemies traitors rather than legitimate opponents. Succession statutes that treat conquered dynasties like constitutional errors requiring correction, and judicial reasoning that makes political murder look like law enforcement. Contemporary sources outside England reveal awareness that Henry's death was politically convenient. The Burgundian chronicler Philippe de Comines notes how quickly the Yorkist version of events became established fact, suggesting sophisticated understanding of how political narratives get manufactured and distributed. And he wouldn't be the last to lose twice, once in life, once in memory. Bosworth Field, August 22nd, 1485. The last Yorkist king dies in battle, but his real trial begins afterward. In chronicles written by Tudor historians who need to convert political victory into moral verdict that justifies the new dynasty through demonization of the old. The battle itself lasts only a few hours, but the character assassination will continue for centuries. Richard III dies fighting, crown allegedly found in a hawthorn bush, but his reputation dies more slowly through systematic historical revision that makes Tudor conquest look like divine correction of obvious tyranny. The official story becomes historical legend. Hunchbacked villain who murdered innocent nephews, destroyed by righteous Henry Tudor. Divine providence correcting usurper who corrupted legitimate succession. Tyranny eliminated through holy war blessed by heaven and sanctified by victory. But the reality reveals how dynastic exhaustion creates succession panic, and how victors curate the record to make their conquest look like constitutional restoration rather than political opportunism. Richard III becomes history's most successful villain because Tudor propaganda requires him to be monstrous enough to justify Tudor authority. Polydore Virgil's Anglica Historia, commissioned by Henry VII, establishes the canonical version of Richard's villainy. Written decades after Bosworth, the chronicle presents Richard as physically and morally deformed tyrant whose elimination was divine necessity rather than political convenience. The evidence survives in hostile versus sympathetic chronicle traditions that reveal how political requirements shape historical narrative, administrative acts that show how Richard's actual governance differed from later propaganda characterizations, and contemporary accounts written before Tudor victory made demonization politically necessary. The Crowland Chronicle, written closer to events, presents Richard as competent but ruthless politician rather than monstrous tyrant. The administrative records from Richard's reign show effective governance, judicial reforms, trade regulations, military preparations that contradict later characterizations of incompetent tyranny. Multiple Richards emerge from documentary sources: competent administrator who strengthened northern governance, ruthless politician who eliminated rivals through constitutional manipulation, and dedicated king who defended English independence against foreign interference. Each characterization serves different political narratives. The Tudor propaganda machine demonstrates sophisticated understanding of historical manipulation. Character assassination that makes regicide look like pest control. Constitutional interpretation that treats conquest as restoration, and narrative construction that converts political victory into moral judgment blessed by divine providence. Thomas More's History of King Richard III, written under Henry VIII, crystallizes the propaganda into literary masterpiece. Richard becomes archetypal tyrant whose physical deformity reflects moral corruption, whose political crimes justify his dynastic extinction, whose death represents divine justice rather than military accident. Hostile sources describe Richard as physically deformed, mentally unbalanced, morally corrupt, and politically incompetent. But these sources emerge after Bosworth, written by chroniclers serving Tudor patrons who required moral justification for their political victory. Contemporary sources are more circumspect. Sympathetic traditions describe Richard as effective administrator, dedicated king, and victim of Tudor propaganda campaign designed to justify questionable political claims through character destruction. These sources get marginalized in official historical tradition, but survive in alternative narrative traditions. This reveals how medieval historical writing functions as constitutional technology. Narrative construction that converts conquest into restoration through character manipulation that makes defeated rulers look like obstacles to legitimate governance rather than legitimate rulers destroyed by political ambition. The economic evidence suggests different interpretation. Richard's financial policies threatened established interests that supported Tudor invasion. His attempts to regulate trade practices and strengthen royal authority created enemies among merchants and nobles who found Henry Tudor's promises more appealing than Richard's reforms. But the pattern isn't only Christian courts. It's any system where legitimacy is sacred. Cordoba, 1031. The last Umayyad Caliph of Al-Andalus dies, and Islamic Spain discovers that caliphates can simply stop existing when nobody has sufficient authority to enforce central coordination. This is how imperial systems end, not through conquest, but through administrative dissolution. The year begins with Hisham III ruling from the Alcazar of Córdoba, but ruling what exactly has become unclear. The caliphate that once commanded tribute from Leon to the Mediterranean has fragmented into regional power centers that acknowledge the caliph ceremonially while governing themselves practically. The official story speaks of collapse into factionalism, weak central authority losing control to regional powers, natural fragmentation when imperial coordination becomes impossible to maintain, political evolution that strengthens regional governance through elimination of ineffective central administration. But the reality reveals how institutions fail when they can no longer enforce unity, and how titles become meaningless when the administrative machinery that gives them substance disappears. Hisham III remains caliph until his death, but the caliphate stops functioning as a political institution years before he dies. The Dhikr Bilad al-Andalus describes how regional governors stopped sending tax revenues to Córdoba, ceased requesting central authorization for major decisions, and began conducting independent diplomacy with Christian kingdoms. The empire dissolves through bureaucratic independence rather than military rebellion. The evidence lies in political fragmentation documented through administrative breakdown, regional governors who stop seeking central confirmation for their acts, local dynasties that begin conducting independent foreign policy, and taxation systems that convert imperial resources into regional assets without central authorization. The Taifa kingdoms emerge not through dramatic rebellion, but through administrative pragmatism. Local governors discover they can govern more effectively without central interference. Regional dynasties find they can conduct more profitable diplomacy by dealing directly with Christian kingdoms rather than channeling negotiations through Córdoba. The Umayyad Caliphate doesn't fall to Christian conquest. It dissolves through institutional failure that makes central coordination impossible to maintain. The Taifa kingdoms emerge not through rebellion, but through administrative necessity when regional governance becomes more effective than imperial administration. Ibn Hayyan's chronicle reveals the systematic nature of this dissolution. Military commanders start recruiting independently of central authorization. Judicial officials begin applying regional rather than imperial legal interpretations. Economic administrators convert imperial taxation into regional revenue collection. Multiple successor states claim legitimacy through different constitutional theories. Some maintain fiction of Umayyad authorization. Others establish independence through military capability. Still others seek external recognition through diplomatic relationships that bypass former imperial authority entirely. The Abbadid dynasty in Seville claims to govern on behalf of absent Umayyad authority while exercising completely independent rule. The Hammudid dynasty in Malaga establishes competing caliphate claiming superior legitimacy to Córdoba. The Zirids in Granada abandon caliphal pretensions entirely, ruling as regional monarchs. This demonstrates how medieval imperial systems end when they lose the capacity for institutional maintenance. Not dramatic collapse, but gradual irrelevance that makes central authority unnecessary for local governance. The caliphate becomes historical artifact while former provinces become functioning kingdoms. Contemporary Christian sources describe this fragmentation with mixture of opportunity and confusion. The Chronicle of Sampiro notes how many kings arose in the lands of the Saracens, each ruling according to his own law rather than common authority. And now, the nuclear endings, where the sacred center becomes an afterimage. Baghdad, February 20th, 1258. The last Abbasid caliph dies during Mongol conquest of Baghdad, and the Islamic world discovers that even the sacred center of Muslim political authority becomes administrative detail when imperial systems eliminate incompatible governance structures. The siege begins on January 11th, with Mongol forces surrounding the city that had been the center of Islamic civilization for 5 centuries. The Abbasid Caliphate, reduced to ceremonial authority within Baghdad's walls, faces imperial efficiency that treats religious legitimacy like administrative complexity requiring elimination. The official story speaks of catastrophe, divine decree, punishment for corruption, judgment for weakness, natural consequence when political institutions fail to maintain strength necessary for survival in competitive international system. But the reality reveals how power structures fail when confronted with more efficient administrative alternatives, and how authority shifts from traditional institutions to functional systems regardless of religious or cultural legitimacy. Al-Mustasim's execution isn't religious persecution, it's institutional streamlining. Hulagu Khan's approach to Baghdad demonstrates how Mongol conquest operates when imperial efficiency encounters traditional authority. The siege is methodical, systematic isolation, negotiated surrender, careful elimination of leadership structures that might complicate future administration. The evidence survives in conquest accounts that treat caliphate elimination like regional administration requiring reorganization, institutional aftermath documentation that shows how Mongol governance replaces Islamic administrative systems, and diplomatic records that demonstrate how political authority transfers from traditional to functional institutions. Juzjani's Tabakat-i-Nasiri provides the most detailed account of the city's fall. The Mongols offer terms that preserve the population while eliminating the political structure. Al-Mustasim's death is described as administrative necessity rather than personal revenge. The caliph represents institutional alternative that complicates imperial coordination. The Mongol approach to Islamic institutions is methodical. Systematic elimination of administrative structures that compete with imperial coordination. Replacement of religious authority with secular administration, and integration of useful elements into imperial systems while discarding incompatible traditions. This is where medieval political theory encounters ultimate pragmatism. When institutional efficiency conflicts with traditional authority, efficiency wins regardless of religious significance or cultural legitimacy. The caliphate doesn't survive because it represents sacred tradition. It disappears because it represents administrative complexity. Baghdad's destruction demonstrates how imperial conquest functions when efficiency takes priority over cultural preservation. Libraries burned not from anti-intellectual hatred, but from administrative indifference to local knowledge systems. Religious institutions eliminated not from theological hostility, but from political irrelevance to imperial governance requirements. The House of Wisdom, repository of Islamic scholarship, disappears not through deliberate cultural destruction, but through systematic conversion of urban space to imperial administrative requirements. The Mongols don't hate learning. They simply don't need Islamic institutional structures for imperial governance. Al-Mustasim dies because he represents institutional alternative to Mongol administration, not because he's evil or incompetent, but because alternative institutions complicate imperial coordination. The caliphate ends because it conflicts with imperial efficiency, not because it conflicts with imperial ideology. Picture the final scene. The sacred center of Islamic political authority eliminated through administrative reorganization that treats religious institutions like regional governance problems requiring solution through institutional replacement rather than accommodation. But nothing prepares you for what comes next, because the final act is about how endings get packaged as peace. Cairo, 1171. The last Fatimid caliph dies in carefully managed obscurity, and Egypt discovers that dynasties can be eliminated through administrative evolution disguised as institutional reform rather than dramatic conquest requiring moral justification. September 13th, 1171. Al-Adid dies at age 21, and within hours, Saladin abolishes the Fatimid Caliphate through administrative decree that treats dynastic extinction like bureaucratic reorganization. No battles, no dramatic confrontations, no public executions. Just quiet elimination through constitutional evolution. The official story speaks of orderly transition. Corrupt dynasty replaced by competent administration, religious authority transferred to legitimate successors. Political stability preserved through wise leadership that prioritizes realm welfare over dynastic privilege. But the reality reveals how puppet governments function as transition mechanisms, and how dynasties get extinguished through administrative rebranding that makes elimination look like institutional improvement. Al-Adid rules Egypt while Saladin governs it, until the distinction becomes meaningless. The process begins years before Al-Adid's death, when Saladin arrives in Egypt as military commander, supporting the failing Fatimid regime against Crusader threats. The arrangement appears mutually beneficial. Egyptian resources support Saladin's campaigns, while Saladin's military capability preserves Fatimid authority. But the administrative reality reveals systematic transfer of authority from ceremonial to functional leadership. Saladin gradually assumes responsibility for military affairs, then financial administration, then diplomatic correspondence, until Al-Adid becomes figurehead whose authority exists primarily through ceremonial recognition. The evidence lies in administrative shifts that show how real authority transfers while ceremonial authority continues. Ideological rebranding that converts conquest into restoration, and institutional documentation that treats dynasty elimination like constitutional evolution rather than political murder. Ibn al-Athir's chronicle reveals the sophisticated management of this transition. Saladin doesn't abolish the Fatimid Caliphate through dramatic confrontation. He allows it to wither through administrative irrelevance while preparing alternative institutional structures that make Fatimid authority redundant. The religious transformation is particularly significant. Saladin gradually replaces Fatimid religious officials with administrators loyal to Abbasid orthodoxy, shifts Friday prayers from Fatimid to Abbasid formulae, and redirects religious revenues from Fatimid institutions to Orthodox Islamic foundations. Saladin doesn't conquer the Fatimid Caliphate. He inherits it through administrative takeover that preserves institutional continuity while eliminating dynastic control. The transition looks smooth because it's managed to look smooth, not because it happens naturally. Al-Adid's death becomes administrative convenience rather than political crisis. The young caliph dies without heirs, eliminating succession problems that might complicate Saladin's constitutional revolution. The Fatimid dynasty ends through natural extinction that coincides suspiciously with political necessity. Contemporary sources reveal careful management of this transition to minimize resistance. The Egyptian population experiences improved administration and military security under Saladin's governance. The elimination of Fatimid authority becomes associated with practical benefits rather than political oppression. Saladin's letters to the Abbasid Caliph demonstrate how systematically this transfer was planned. The correspondence describes the restoration of Orthodox authority to Egypt as administrative correction rather than conquest, making dynastic extinction look like institutional improvement. The earth yields little, but the ink remains. Constantinople, 1056. The last Macedonian dynasty empress dies after decades of political isolation, and Byzantium discovers that legitimacy through birth becomes liability when court factions prefer manufactured authority to inherited obligation. August 31st, 1056. Theodora dies at age 75, ending a dynasty that had ruled the Byzantine Empire for nearly 2 centuries. Her death occurs in a palace that tolerates her presence while preparing systematically for post-Macedonian governance, making her final years a prolonged administrative funeral. The official story speaks of stability maintained, natural evolution toward more effective governance, institutional adaptation that strengthens imperial authority through meritocratic selection, constitutional development that preserves empire while modernizing administrative systems. But the reality reveals how elite resistance operates against dynastic extinction when inherited authority conflicts with factional interests, and how ancient bloodlines become political obstacles requiring careful management rather than traditional assets deserving automatic respect. Theodora's reign exposes the fundamental tension between inherited legitimacy and functional governance. The Macedonian dynasty's authority derived from military success and administrative competence that had secured the empire's borders and prosperity for generations. But by 1056, that competence had devolved into ceremonial recognition, while real authority operated through court factions. The Sellos Chronicle provides crucial details about Theodora's political isolation. Michael Sellos describes how imperial advisors treated her authority like constitutional formality, requiring respectful acknowledgement while conducting substantive governance through alternative channels that bypassed imperial authorization. The evidence survives in court narratives that frame Theodora's reign as transitional necessity rather than legitimate authority. Succession framing that treats her rule like regency requiring external completion, and administrative records that show how imperial institutions prepare for post-Macedonian governance while she remains alive. Isaac I, Komnenos' subsequent accession, demonstrates how systematically this transition was managed. The military aristocracy doesn't rebel against Theodora. They arrange her abdication through pressure that makes continued rule uncomfortable, while offering retirement arrangements that preserve imperial dignity. Theodora rules through sufferance rather than right, tolerated by court factions that can't eliminate her but refuse to acknowledge her authority as permanent. Her death solves institutional problems that her life created simply by representing dynastic continuity that conflicted with contemporary political requirements. The administrative documents reveal how thoroughly the court had prepared for post-Macedonian governance. Military commands were gradually transferred to Komnenian supporters. Fiscal administration shifted toward systems that favored aristocratic rather than imperial control. Judicial appointments reflected factional rather than dynastic priorities. Contemporary sources describe the imperial court's systematic isolation of Theodora from substantive decision-making. The Synopsis Historiarum notes how the empress remained in the palace while governance moved to other chambers, suggesting administrative arrangements that preserved ceremonial respect while eliminating practical authority. And then comes the lesson every court learns. Reform threatens beneficiaries. Constantinople, September 12, 1185. The emperor who tried to clean up Byzantine administration dies in palace revolution, led by the aristocrats he attempted to reform, and the empire discovers that institutional change threatens the people who benefit from institutional corruption. The mob drags Andronikos through the streets of Constantinople, while aristocrats who had tolerated corruption for decades suddenly discover moral outrage at imperial reform attempts. The emperor, who had tried to strengthen Byzantine governance, dies because reform threatens beneficiaries more than corruption threatens institutions. The official story presents tyranny corrected. Oppressive ruler eliminated by justified uprising. Aristocratic resistance that preserved traditional governance against revolutionary extremism. Natural restoration of proper order after brief period of administrative confusion. But the reality reveals how political violence combined with narrative cleanup equals dynasty. Extinction where order gets redefined by the victors. Andronikos doesn't just lose power. He gets posthumously tried through historical revision that converts reform attempts into evidence of tyrannical instability. The Choniates Chronicle provides the most detailed account of Andronikos's reform program and its political consequences. Nikitas Choniates describes how imperial attempts to eliminate administrative corruption threatened established interests that had prospered through systematic exploitation of imperial resources. Andronikos's reforms targeted practices that had become institutionalized. Judicial corruption that allowed wealthy litigants to purchase favorable verdicts. Administrative appointment sales that converted imperial offices into commercial investments. And tax collection systems that enriched collectors while impoverishing imperial revenues. The evidence lies in hostile sources that describe reform as oppression, while carefully obscuring the interests that reform threatened. Administrative aftermath that shows how restoration benefits specific aristocratic factions, and chronicle manipulation that presents aristocratic rebellion as popular uprising blessed by divine providence. The aristocratic opposition demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to package resistance as liberation. Reform attempts get reframed as tyrannical innovations. Administrative efficiency becomes oppressive interference. Corruption elimination becomes attack on traditional privileges that aristocrats characterize as constitutional rights. The Komnenian Restoration demonstrates how medieval political change gets justified through historical revision. Andronikos becomes monster, who threatened legitimate governance. His reforms become tyrannical innovations that violated traditional authority. And his elimination becomes constitutional necessity that preserved imperial stability. Isaac II Angelos's subsequent reign validates aristocratic opposition through systematic reversal of Andronikos's reforms. Judicial corruption returns as restoration of traditional legal procedures. Administrative appointments resume sale as constitutional limitation of imperial arbitrary power. Tax collection reverts to systems that enrich collectors while bankrupting imperial treasury. Contemporary sources reveal how systematically Andronikos's reputation was destroyed through posthumous character assassination. The Chronica Byzantina describes him as bloodthirsty tyrant, whose reform attempts were motivated by sadistic pleasure rather than administrative necessity. Which brings us to the most iconic ending, where a crown becomes a ghost. Constantinople, May 29th, 1453. The last Byzantine emperor dies on the walls of his city, and the Roman Empire, 1,000 years after Rome fell, finally closes a parenthesis that lasted a millennium. But even this ending gets managed through administrative transition disguised as conquest. The dawn breaks over Constantinople's walls as Constantine XI prepares for the final assault, knowing that this day will determine not just his fate, but the fate of an empire that has endured for over 1,000 years since Rome's fall. The purple boots, the imperial crown, the golden eagle, all will die with him in the breach. The official story speaks of heroic last stand, courageous emperor defending Christian civilization against Islamic conquest, noble resistance that preserves Byzantine honor even when Byzantine independence becomes impossible to maintain, martyrdom that transforms political defeat into spiritual victory. But the reality reveals how reduced sovereignty makes titles ceremonial, when territorial control becomes insufficient to support institutional independence, and how empires end through administrative absorption rather than dramatic destruction. Constantine XI dies defending a city-state that calls itself an empire because nobody has authority to revoke the title. The Critoboulos Chronicle provides crucial details about the empire's final months. The Byzantine Empire of 1453 consists essentially of Constantinople and its immediate suburbs, an urban enclave maintaining imperial dignity while exercising authority over territory smaller than many provincial cities. The evidence survives in siege accounts that reveal how Byzantine independence existed through Ottoman permission rather than Byzantine capability. Diplomatic context that shows how the siege was administrative formality rather than military uncertainty, and conquest records that treat Byzantine elimination like urban planning project rather than imperial warfare. Mehmed II's approach to Byzantine elimination demonstrates sophisticated understanding of how to manage imperial transitions. The siege is methodical. Systematic isolation, negotiated surrender offers, careful preservation of administrative personnel who can facilitate peaceful transition from Byzantine to Ottoman governance. The diplomatic correspondence reveals how thoroughly this transition was planned as administrative reorganization rather than cultural conquest. Ottoman documents describe the siege as correction of anomalous political arrangement rather than imperial expansion requiring justification. The Ottoman approach to Byzantine elimination demonstrates how medieval imperial systems end obsolete institutions, not through ideological conquest, but through administrative integration that makes separate governance redundant. Constantinople becomes Istanbul through renaming that reflects political reality rather than cultural transformation. Constantine XI's death preserves Byzantine honor while eliminating Byzantine governance, allowing the empire to end heroically while the city transitions smoothly to Ottoman administration. The title dies with dignity, while the population continues under new management. Contemporary accounts reveal how systematically the Ottomans managed this transition to minimize disruption. The conquest preserves urban infrastructure while eliminating political structures. The population experiences continuity of basic services while adjusting to new administrative authorities. And finally, an ending negotiated as peace that closes an era. January 2nd, 1492. The Alhambra's gardens glisten with frost as the last Nasrid king prepares to hand over keys that have unlocked 8 centuries of Islamic rule in Iberia. The surrender ceremony is choreographed like theater, dignified, respectful, almost gentle. But this theatrical mercy masks something far more final, the conversion of a dynasty into a footnote. The morning begins with Muhammad XII, known to his Christian enemies as Boabdil, preparing for the ceremonial transfer of Granada to Ferdinand and Isabella. The Capitulaciones de Granada promise generous terms, religious freedom, legal autonomy, cultural preservation. But the document that saves lives eliminates dynasties. The official narrative presents Muhammad XII's surrender as peaceful transfer, a wise ruler choosing negotiation over destruction, saving his people from siege warfare, accepting the inevitable with grace. The Catholic monarchs are magnanimous in victory. The terms are generous. History closes a chapter without a massacre. But the reality beneath this diplomatic courtesy reveals how civil strife, siege pressure, and negotiated endings convert a dynasty into administrative aftermath. The surrender terms look generous on parchment. The implementation becomes systematic erasure through bureaucratic efficiency. The Chronicle of Hernando de Pulgar provides crucial details about the surrender negotiations. The terms preserve Muslim religious practices, maintain Islamic legal traditions, and protect property rights of Muslim subjects. But the legal language carefully distinguishes between temporary accommodation and permanent constitutional recognition. The evidence is found in surrender documents that promise protection for Muslim subjects, contemporary accounts that describe the ceremony's dignity, and aftermath policies that demonstrate how negotiated peace becomes cultural extinction. Within a decade, the generous terms become optional suggestions. Within a generation, they become historical curiosities. Muhammad XII's exile to the Alpujarras demonstrates how systematically this transition was managed. The former king receives generous financial support and territorial compensation. But his authority exists entirely through Castilian permission rather than Islamic legitimacy. He becomes pensioner rather than ruler. Here's the final revelation. The curse of medieval dynasties was never supernatural judgment or cosmic justice. It was a technology of control, doctrine, law, and narrative engineering working together to make dynastic extinction look like divine plan. The curse is the system itself, the way medieval power structures learned to end bloodlines and justify it. The Inquisition records reveal how systematically Islamic identity was eliminated through administrative efficiency that made persecution look like pastoral care. Forced conversions get documented as spiritual awakenings. Property confiscations become evidence of voluntary departure. Exile becomes liberation from false religious obligations. Muhammad XII disappears into exile. The Nasrid line ends not with battle cries, but with property transfers. The last Islamic kingdom in Western Europe becomes a Catholic province. But the documents are careful to call it restoration, not conquest. Completion, not destruction. The inevitable end of something that was always temporary. The legal machinery survives in administrative records that demonstrate how systematically Islamic Granada was converted into Christian Andalusia. The Archivo General de Simancas preserves documents showing how Islamic law gets replaced with Castilian legal codes, how mosque properties become church foundations, and how Islamic educational institutions become instruments of Christian instruction. The curse isn't a spell. It's a system that knows how to end a bloodline and justify it. Across centuries and continents, the pattern holds with mechanical consistency. Religion legitimizes violence. Law reroutes inheritance. Dissent is criminalized as moral failure. Memory is rewritten by sanctioned chroniclers. The medieval system perfected something genuinely terrifying: the ability to end a bloodline and make it look like divine will. The darkest truth whispered through these 30 stories is how many victims remain unnamed because the system was designed to erase them. Their stories survive only because something went wrong in the attempt to bury them. A contradictory entry in an annal, a witness list on a charter, an administrative record nobody could smooth over entirely. What we've seen is not corruption at the edges of medieval power. It was baked into the foundation, a surveillance network of oaths, seals, and denunciations that functioned less like faith and more like early bureaucratic control. The Church didn't just bless political outcomes. It manufactured them through legal theology that could convert any inconvenient ruler into a moral problem requiring correction. These weren't isolated tragedies or exceptional crimes. They were standard operating procedure for a system that had learned to package dynasty extinction as divine plan. The curse was never supernatural. It was technological, a medieval machinery of legitimacy that could be operated by anyone who controlled the right combination of military force, legal authority, and narrative power. The question that haunts these 30 stories isn't whether these kings deserved their fates. It's simpler and more unsettling. If the people who control the archive can decide who was lawful, who was heretical, and who deserved to fall, how many dynasties were doomed by external judgment, and how many were pushed by the very institutions that claimed to protect royal authority? The silence in the records isn't neutral. It's evidence. Every missing name, every smooth transition, every convenient death that solved a succession crisis. These weren't accidents. They were features of a system that had learned how to edit reality through administrative precision. That's the final curse. We'll never know how many stories were successfully buried, because successful burial leaves no trace. We only have these 30 because somewhere, somehow, the machinery broke down and let the truth leak through. How many other bloodlines ended in medieval darkness, their extinction so complete that we don't even know they existed to be destroyed? What's your take on this piece of history? Drop your thoughts below, because every perspective keeps these stories alive.